Somewhere in the darkness before the flood, an enormous being closes his eyes and dreams. He's not human, not quite. He's taller than any man has a right to be, stronger than anything walking the earth. And in his dream he watches his own world get torn apart, uprooted trees, flooded gardens, a tablet of judgment written against everyone he loves. He wakes up shaking. He doesn't understand what he's seen. So he does the only thing he can think to do. He goes looking for someone who might. That someone is Enoch, and the being having the nightmare is a giant named Ohyah, the son of a fallen angel and a human woman caught between two worlds that were never supposed to mix. This is the opening scene, more or less, of one of the strangest texts to survive from the ancient world. It's called the Book of Giants, and for most of history almost nobody knew it existed. You've probably heard of the Book of Enoch. Maybe you've heard whispers about giants in the Bible, angels who fell from heaven, forbidden knowledge, monstrous offspring. But the Book of Giants isn't just a footnote to that story. It's its own text, torn into pieces, scattered across a cave in the Judean desert for 2,000 years before anyone pieced together what it actually said. And what it says complicates almost everything you thought you knew about Enoch, the Watchers and the giants that supposedly walked the earth before the flood. Here's where people usually get the story wrong. They hear that fragments of the Book of Giants were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they assume it's simple, that this was just leftover material, deleted scenes from the Book of Enoch that didn't make the final cut. Extra scraps that got cut for space or theology and tossed in a cave like discarded film reels. That's not what happened. The Book of Giants isn't Enoch's leftovers. It's a separate composition entirely, written probably by a different hand, filling in gaps that the Book of Enoch never bothered to address. What did the giants actually think in their final days, watching judgment close in around them? What did it feel like to be caught between angelic fathers and human mothers, monstrous and doomed? Enoch tells you what happened to the world. The Book of Giants tries to tell you what happened to them. Over the next while, we're going to piece this story back together the way scholars did, fragment by fragment, cave by cave. We'll meet the Watchers, the angels who abandoned heaven for human wives. We'll meet their children, giants with names like Ohyah and Hahyah, dreaming dreams they can't interpret, sending messengers to a prophet who barely wants to answer them. We'll follow this text as it vanishes from Qumran, resurfaces centuries later in Manichaean communities thousands of miles away, wearing new names and speaking new languages, and somehow survives long enough for modern scholars to drag it back into the light, one torn parchment at a time. If you're listening to this to drift off, that's exactly what it's here for. So go ahead, subscribe if you haven't, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing it. Tokyo at sunrise, Chicago at midnight, all scrolling past on the same page. And if you want to actually support the channel in a way that helps more than almost anything else, follow the show on Spotify. Listen there, and if you're enjoying it, leave a 5-star review. The link's in the description. It costs nothing, takes about 10 seconds, and it's genuinely the biggest thing you can do to keep these stories being told. Now, close your eyes, settle in, and let's go back to the world before the flood, when angels still remembered what heaven looked like, and their children were just beginning to realize what they'd become. So what exactly is the Book of Giants? That question sounds simple, but the honest answer is more complicated than you'd expect, and getting that complication right matters for everything that follows. Let's start with what it isn't. It isn't a book in the way you'd normally think of one. There's no cover, no title page, no neat beginning, middle and end sitting on a shelf somewhere waiting to be read cover to cover. What survives is fragments, torn pieces of parchment, some no bigger than a few square inches, covered in Aramaic script that's faded, cracked, and in places completely illegible. Scholars have spent decades trying to arrange these fragments into something resembling a coherent narrative, and even now, after all that work, there are gaps. Sentences that trail off into nothing. Scenes we can only guess at because half the words are missing. Characters who appear, disappear, and reappear without any clear explanation of what happened to them in between. Think of it like finding a shattered vase in an archaeological dig. You don't get the vase, you get shards, some large enough to show a clear image, a face, a hand, a piece of pattern, others so small and worn they could be almost anything. Archaeologists piece together what they can, make educated guesses about the rest, and end up with something that's probably close to the original, but almost certainly not identical to it. That's the Book of Giants. Not a complete text, but a reconstruction built from pieces that survived 2,000 years of burial, decay, and pure chance. What makes this reconstruction possible at all is a shared obsession running through every fragment we have. The text keeps circling back to one central concern, over and over, from every angle it can find. What happened to the children of the Watchers? Now, if you don't know who the Watchers were yet, don't worry, we'll get there properly soon. For now, all you need to know is this. According to ancient tradition, a group of angels abandoned their posts in heaven, came down to earth, and took human women as wives. Their children weren't human. They weren't angels either. They were something in between, giants, according to the tradition, enormous in size, immense in strength, and increasingly monstrous in appetite and behaviour as the story goes on. The Book of Giants is their story, not the story of the angels who fathered them, not directly anyway, and not really the story of the humans who mothered them. It's about the giants themselves, these strange hybrid beings caught between two worlds that were never supposed to touch. What did they think about their own existence? What did they dream about? How did they react when they started to sense that judgment was coming for them, that the world that made room for their monstrous existence was about to be washed away? These are the questions the fragments seem determined to answer again and again, through dreams, through dialogue, through desperate attempts by the giants to understand their own fate. This concern connects the Book of Giants to something much larger, a whole tradition of ancient writing scholars now call Enochic literature. Enoch, if you remember your Genesis, is the man who, according to the Bible, walked with God and then simply wasn't, because God took him. That's it. That's the entire biblical account, one cryptic line tucked into a genealogy. But outside the Bible, in texts that never made it into most religious canons, Enoch becomes something much bigger, a prophet who travelled through the heavens, who witnessed the fall of angels, who recorded the sins of the world before the flood in extraordinary, almost hallucinatory detail. The Book of Giants belongs to this same universe. Enoch appears in it directly, as a wise figure the giants turn to for answers. The Watchers appear in it, the coming flood appears in it. It's clearly part of the same expanding tradition, drawing on the same characters, the same theology, the same sense of a world about to be judged and destroyed. But here's something important to understand before we go any further. The name Book of Giants isn't ancient. Nobody who originally wrote or copied this text called it that. It's a modern label given by scholars trying to describe what they were looking at once the fragments started coming together in the 20th century. We don't actually know what the original authors called their own work, if they called it anything at all. We don't know if it circulated as a single unified composition from the very beginning, or if it developed in pieces, expanded over time by different hands, adding their own material to an existing core. The title is a convenience, a shorthand that helps us talk about something whose original shape remains, frankly, uncertain. And that uncertainty only deepens when you look at how the text travelled after Qumran. Because this isn't just an Aramaic story confined to one set of caves in the Judean desert. Centuries after those original fragments were copied and buried, versions of this same narrative resurface in an entirely different context, adopted and adapted by a religious movement called Manichaeism, founded far to the east, drawing on Persian, Christian and Gnostic influences all at once. Manichaean scribes translated and reworked the Book of Giants into their own languages, Middle Persian, Parthian, Sogdian, even fragments in other Central Asian tongues, changing names, shifting details, fitting the story into their own cosmology. The giants get new names in these versions. Some of the angelic figures get renamed too, adapted to fit a Manichaean framework that had very different theological priorities than whatever Jewish community originally produced the Aramaic version at Qumran. This is genuinely remarkable when you stop to think about it. A story written in Aramaic, buried in the Judean desert, forgotten for centuries, somehow finds its way east, gets picked up by an entirely different religious movement, translated into languages spoken along the Silk Road, and survives there too, in fragments just as broken and incomplete as the ones found near the Dead Sea. Two separate manuscript traditions, thousands of miles apart, both preserving pieces of what seems to be fundamentally the same ancient narrative. So when we talk about the Book of Giants, we're really talking about a patchwork, Aramaic fragments from Qumran, Manichaean fragments from Central Asia, all pointing towards some original story about the children of fallen angels and their final days before the flood. No single version gives us the whole picture. But together, cross-referenced and compared, they let scholars reconstruct something remarkably close to what ancient readers once knew as a complete and coherent tale. That's what we're working with, fragments pointing toward a lost whole. And now it's time to see exactly how those fragments were found in the first place. To understand where the Book of Giants came from, you have to go to one of the driest, harshest landscapes on Earth, the western shore of the Dead Sea, a place where the ground is white with salt, the hills are bare and broken, and summer heat can make the air feel almost solid. It doesn't look like the kind of place where one of the greatest manuscript discoveries in history would be waiting. But then, history has a habit of hiding in places nobody wants to search. Near the ruins of an ancient settlement called Qumran, a series of caves cuts into the limestone cliffs above the Dead Sea. In the late 1940s, these caves began yielding something extraordinary. Ancient scrolls. Not one or two isolated documents, but a huge collection of manuscripts and manuscript fragments written mostly in Hebrew and Aramaic, with a smaller number in Greek. Some were copies of books now found in the Hebrew Bible. Others were prayers, legal rules, commentaries, calendars, hymns, visions and writings that had been lost for nearly 2,000 years. And among those lost writings were pieces of the Book of Giants. The popular version of the discovery usually begins with a young Bedouin shepherd, a missing goat, and a stone thrown into a cave. He hears pottery break inside. He climbs in, finds tall jars, and inside the jars, old rolled-up manuscripts wrapped in cloth. It's a perfect story. Too perfect, maybe, and like many perfect stories, the details get blurry when you look closely. Different people later told different versions. The names of the shepherds vary. The missing goat may or may not have been real. The stone may have been thrown while searching for an animal, or simply while exploring. What seems clear is that Bedouin men from the Tamaray tribe found the first manuscripts in a cave near Qumran, sometime around 1946 or 1947. They recognized that the old leather scrolls might be worth something. They brought them to dealers, monks, scholars, and eventually the news spread. That much is history. The rest has become legend. And it matters that we separate the two, because the Dead Sea Scrolls are already strange and fascinating enough, without turning them into a mystery novel. Nobody needs to invent secret codes, buried treasure maps, or some lost conspiracy of monks guarding forbidden books. The actual story is more interesting. It is the story of ancient Jewish communities preserving an astonishing range of writings, and of modern scholars trying to recover their meaning from material that survived only by accident, climate, and sheer improbability. After the first cave was discovered, archaeologists and Bedouin searchers began finding more. Eventually, 11 caves in the Qumran area produced manuscripts or fragments. Some contained relatively well-preserved scrolls, others contained little more than thousands of dry, dark scraps of parchment and papyrus. The desert had preserved them because it was so dry. But preservation is not the same as perfection. A scroll can survive 2,000 years and still arrive in the modern world cracked, chewed by insects, blackened by age, and shattered into pieces the size of a fingernail. This is especially important for the Book of Giants. When people hear that the Book of Giants was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, they sometimes imagine a complete hidden book, perhaps rolled carefully into a jar, waiting for someone to unseal it and read its secrets. That isn't what happened. The Book of Giants survives at Qumran in fragments. Small pieces, lines with words missing at the beginning and end, names appearing in one place, then turning up again on another fragment whose original position cannot be proven. Sometimes a few letters are all that remain, sometimes a phrase, sometimes enough of a passage to tell us that giants are discussing dreams, or that Enoch is delivering a warning, but not enough to tell us exactly what came before or after. Think about what that means. You're not reading a lost book directly. You're looking through a keyhole at a lost book. You can see a little of the room beyond, enough to know there is furniture there, maybe a fire burning figures moving in the dark. But you cannot see the whole room, and if you start confidently describing every corner, every object, every person standing there, you're no longer doing history. You're decorating the darkness. The manuscript evidence sets limits. It tells us what we can say. It also tells us when to stop. The fragments associated with the Book of Giants were copied in Aramaic, the everyday language spoken across much of the ancient Near East and widely used among Jews in the centuries before and after the time of Jesus. That alone tells us something important. This was not a late medieval fantasy and not a modern invention pasted onto the Bible. It belonged to a real ancient Jewish world, a world in which readers and writers were taking a few mysterious verses from Genesis and building them into enormous stories about angels, giants, heaven, judgment, and the flood. But it was only one part of that world. The Qumran manuscripts do not represent a single neat library in the modern sense. There was no catalogue card saying Book of Giants, Shelf 3, next to Enoch. What we have is a collection of writings found in and around caves near an ancient settlement. Scholars debate exactly who collected them, who copied them, and why they ended up in the caves. Many think at least some were hidden during the upheavals of the 1st century, perhaps as Roman forces moved through Judea. Others urge caution. The caves may have been used in different ways at different times. Not every manuscript necessarily came from the same group or had the same history. Still, the collection is remarkable for its diversity. There are copies of Genesis, Exodus, Isaiah, Psalms, and many other biblical books. There are texts that interpret Scripture in ways familiar to no modern synagogue or church. There are community rules describing discipline, shared property, ritual purity, and the behaviour expected from members of a religious group. There are prayers and hymns. There are writings concerned with the movements of the sun and moon, with sacred calendars, with angels, demons, priests, wars, and the end of history. And there are Enochic writings. This is where the Book of Giants finds its natural home, not as an isolated tale about monsters, but as part of a much wider stream of Jewish thought. The people who copied these manuscripts, whoever exactly they were, cared deeply about the old figure of Enoch. They preserved writings about his heavenly journeys, his visions, his knowledge of the cosmos, and his role in explaining the corruption of the world before the flood. The Book of Giants belongs in that orbit. It shares characters and concerns with the better-known Book of Watchers, part of what later became 1 Enoch. It assumes a universe crowded with heavenly beings and haunted by the consequences of their rebellion. And the most important place for this material was Cave 4. Cave 4 was not the dramatic cave of legend with a few scroll jars standing in the darkness. It was, in some ways, far more important. Discovered in 1952, Cave 4 contained an overwhelming mass of manuscript debris. Tens of thousands of fragments from hundreds of different texts. It was like finding the remains of an ancient library after someone had fed it into a shredder 2,000 years ago. This cave produced many of the fragments connected with Enochic literature, including pieces assigned to the Book of Giants. It is also one reason scholars can say that Enochic traditions were not obscure curiosities. They were copied, read, and preserved alongside biblical manuscripts and other religious writings. That doesn't mean every person in ancient Judea accepted them. It doesn't mean they held the same authority everywhere. Ancient Judaism was not one uniform system with one agreed list of sacred books. It was a crowded, argumentative world, full of competing interpretations and different communities. But at Qumran, Enoch mattered, and the giants mattered enough to be written down. There is something almost eerie about that. For centuries, the Book of Giants disappeared. Its Aramaic pages broke apart. Its words vanished into caves above a sea so salty that almost nothing can live in it. Then, by chance, pieces emerged again into the modern world. Not enough to restore the book completely, not enough to silence every argument, but enough to prove that this strange story once circulated among real readers, copied by real hands, in a language still visible on the parchment. And now the problem becomes even more difficult. Finding fragments is one thing. Figuring out which fragment belongs where, which handwriting belongs to which manuscript, and what a broken line once said, is something else entirely. And this is where the romance of the Dead Sea Scrolls gives way to something slower, stranger, and much more difficult. Because a fragment is not a page. A page has margins. It has a beginning and an end. You can turn it over. You can see what comes before and after. A fragment might be a piece of parchment no bigger than a coin, with 3 letters on it. Or half a line, or the ending of a name, and a dark stain where the rest of the sentence used to be. Imagine trying to reconstruct a novel after it has been torn into thousands of pieces, scattered across a floor, soaked, burned at the edges, and left there for 2,000 years. Now imagine that most of the pieces are blank. Some belong to completely different books, and the language is ancient Aramaic. That is not exactly what scholars faced in Cave 4. But it is close enough. The Book of Giants is known from these kinds of remains. One fragment may preserve a giant's name, another may preserve words about a dream. Another may mention Enoch, another may contain language of judgment, destruction, or the flood. Each piece tells us something, but the pieces do not come with arrows, saying, "Put this one after paragraph 7. They do not announce this scene happened before that scene. The ancient scrolls have lost their bindings, their columns, their order, and often most of their words. So Reconstruction begins with the most basic question. What exactly are we looking at? The first clue is handwriting. Ancient scribes did not write like modern printers. Even when they followed conventional letter forms, individual hands had habits. One scribe might make an aleph broad and open, another might compress it into a tight angular shape. One might leave generous spaces between words, Another might crowd letters together as if parchment were expensive, which it was. The thickness of the ink strokes, the angle of letters, the spacing of lines, even the way a scribe repaired an error can help identify a manuscript hand. This field is called paleography. It sounds intimidating, but the basic idea is simple. Handwriting changes over time, and different scribes leave different fingerprints on the page. If two fragments have the same kind of parchment, the same ruling lines, the same ink, and handwriting that appears to come from one person, scholars may conclude that they were once part of the same scroll. Not always, caution is necessary, but it is one way shattered manuscripts begin to become manuscripts again. For the Book of Giants, several Qumran designations are especially important. You may see fragments called 4Q203, 4Q530, 4Q531, 4Q532, and 4Q533. The name sounds like a code from a warehouse inventory, and in a sense, that is what it is. The number 4 means Cave 4. The letter Q means Qumran. The final number identifies a manuscript in the sequence assigned by scholars. So 4Q53 means manuscript number 530 from Cave 4 at Qumran. These designations are useful, but they can also create a false impression. They make it sound as though we have 5 or 6 neatly separate copies of a book called the Book of Giants. What we really have are groups of fragments that scholars associate with this work, or with the larger Giants tradition. Some connections are strong, others remain debated. The boundaries between one manuscript, one version, and one related Enochic text are not always perfectly clear, and that is before we even try to read the missing lines. Suppose a fragment preserves the words, the Giants, then a gap, then Enoch, then another gap, then judgment. That tells us the fragment belongs in the right world. Giants, Enoch, judgment. But it does not automatically tell us the entire scene. Were the Giants asking Enoch for help? Was Enoch warning them? Was someone reporting a vision? A reader can feel the temptation immediately. The mind wants to connect the dots. It wants a complete story. Humans are very good at making patterns, sometimes too good. A few letters can become a word can become a sentence can become a scene, and before long, a scholar, a translator, or an enthusiastic storyteller has built an entire chapter on a scrap of parchment the size of a thumbnail. This does not mean Reconstruction is hopeless. It means Reconstruction has rules. Vocabulary helps. The Book of Giants shares a world with other Enochic writings. It uses names and ideas that show up elsewhere: Enoch, the Watchers, the giant offspring, heavenly judgment, the coming flood. If a broken Aramaic line contains a rare phrase that appears in another related text, that parallel may help fill a gap. If a name survives in one fragment and appears in a later version of the story, that can help identify the character. Overlaps are even better. Sometimes two fragments preserve parts of the same passage. One has the beginning of a line, another has its end. Sometimes the fibres, edges, and writing patterns suggest they were once physically adjacent. Sometimes a phrase is preserved in Aramaic at Qumran, and in a much later translation or adaptation from Central Asia. When independent witnesses preserve similar names, episodes, or wording, the lost shape of the story becomes a little clearer. But only a little. The later versions are especially valuable, because the Book of Giants did not vanish completely after Qumran. Centuries later, Manichaean communities preserved versions of the tale in languages such as Middle Persian, Parthian, Sogdian, and Old Turkic. These texts travelled astonishing distances from the Jewish world of ancient Judea into the religious networks of Iran and Central Asia. They preserved giants with recognizable names. They preserved dreams, warnings, and Enoch's role as a messenger of judgment. In some cases, they seem to confirm that a broken Qumran fragment belongs to the Book of Giants rather than some other lost work. But they are not a magic answer key. The Manichaean texts are much later than the Aramaic fragments. They come from different communities, different languages, and a different religious setting. They may preserve old material faithfully in some places. In other places, they may reshape it. Stories change when they travel. Names shift. Scenes expand. Theology adjusts itself to new audiences. A later version can illuminate an earlier fragment, but it cannot simply be laid over it like a transparent sheet. Think of it like hearing a folk song in several countries hundreds of years apart. The melody is still recognizable. A few lines remain. The hero has the same name, but one version has added verses, another has changed the ending, and a third has turned the old villain into someone else entirely. They are related. They are not identical. This is why careful editions of the Book of Giants can look frustratingly incomplete. A modern translation may include brackets, dots, question marks, and notes saying things like possibly, restored, or uncertain. For a reader hoping for secrets, that can feel disappointing. But those marks are signs of honesty. Brackets usually indicate words supplied by an editor. Dots indicate letters or words that are lost. A question mark means the reading is uncertain. These are not admissions that scholars know nothing. They are reminders that scholars know where the evidence ends. And that matters. The Book of Giants has sometimes been presented as if archaeologists uncovered a complete forbidden gospel of monsters and angels, then assembled it all without difficulty. But the real situation is more interesting than that. We have genuine ancient evidence. We have Aramaic fragments copied before the destruction of the Second Temple. We have names, scenes and themes that clearly belong to a larger narrative. We have later witnesses that preserve echoes of that narrative across continents and centuries. What we do not have is a single complete original scroll. No one can open a museum case, unroll the Book of Giants from beginning to end, and read exactly what every ancient reader read. The modern Book of Giants is a scholarly reconstruction, a careful proposal built from fragments, handwriting, vocabulary, parallels, and later versions. Some parts are solid enough to stand on, others are more like bridges made of rope, useful but not unbreakable. And now that we know how uncertain the reconstruction can be, we can ask the next question. What kind of story were these scattered pieces trying to preserve? To answer that, we have to go backward, before the giants had dreams, before the Watchers came down from heaven, and before the flood was imagined as the answer to a world gone wrong. We have to begin with Enoch. Enoch is one of the strangest figures in the Bible because, at first, he barely seems to be a figure at all. In the book of Genesis, he appears in a genealogy, a long chain of fathers and sons stretching from Adam toward Noah. Adam lived and had Seth. Seth lived and had Enosh. Enosh lived and had Kenan. The pattern goes on, steady and almost hypnotic, generation after generation. Then comes Enoch. Genesis says that Enoch lived 65 years and became the father of Methuselah. After that, he walked with God for 300 years. And then, in a line that has fascinated readers for more than 2,000 years, the text says Enoch was no more, because God took him. That is nearly everything Genesis tells us. No description of what it meant to walk with God. No explanation of where God took him. No death scene. No grave. No final words. Just a man who walked with God and then vanished from the ordinary human story. And perhaps that was exactly why ancient readers could not leave him alone. Most people in Genesis die. The formula is blunt and repetitive. They live for an enormous number of years, they have children, and then they die. Enoch breaks the pattern. He is taken. Later Jewish readers saw an opening in those few words, a small door in the text leading somewhere much larger. If Enoch had been taken by God, perhaps he had entered heaven. And if he had entered heaven, perhaps he had seen things no ordinary person could see. The heavens, the angels, the hidden order of the stars, the places prepared for the dead, the records of human deeds, the future judgment of the wicked, the disaster waiting at the edge of history. This is the Enoch who emerges in ancient Jewish literature. Not merely a name in a genealogy, but a traveller between worlds, a righteous ancestor living before the flood, receiving secrets from heaven and carrying warnings back to earth. The Book of Giants assumes that kind of Enoch already exists. It does not need to spend much time explaining why giants would seek him out, why heavenly beings would know his name, or why his words carried authority. In the world of the Fragments, Enoch is already the person connected with revelation, the man who can interpret dreams, the scribe who receives a message from above, the witness who understands that a coming judgment is not just a bad dream, but a sentence. To understand the giants, then, we need to understand the larger Enochic world that made a character like this possible. The most famous surviving Enochic work is called 1 Enoch. That name can be slightly misleading. It sounds like a single book written by a single author, perhaps by Enoch himself in one uninterrupted act of ancient inspiration. It is not. 1 Enoch is really a collection, a library gathered under one ancient name. Its sections were composed and edited over time, probably across several centuries in the Second Temple period. Different parts have different concerns, different styles, and perhaps different communities behind them. But they were eventually brought together because all of them were connected in one way or another to Enoch. The oldest major section is usually called the Book of Watchers. This is the text most important for the story ahead. The Book of Watchers expands a tiny and difficult passage in Genesis into a full cosmic disaster story. It tells of angelic beings called Watchers who descend to earth, take human women as wives, and father giant offspring. These beings reveal forbidden knowledge. The giants become violent. The earth fills with bloodshed and corruption, and the flood comes into view not simply as a weather event, but as a judgment against a world thrown out of order. Enoch stands near the centre of this drama. He moves between the human and heavenly realms. He delivers messages. He sees the fate prepared for rebellious angels. He learns that some boundaries, once crossed, cannot simply be repaired with an apology. That basic setting, angelic rebellion, giant children violence, heavenly judgment, and Enoch as messenger, is also the setting of the Book of Giants. But 1 Enoch contains much more than the Watchers. Another large section is often called the Astronomical Book, or the Book of the Heavenly Luminaries. Here Enoch is shown the movements of the sun, moon, stars, winds, and seasons. The text describes a carefully ordered cosmos, with gates in the heavens through which lights rise and set. To a modern reader, some of its astronomy may seem unfamiliar. It does not map neatly onto modern science. But that is not really the point. The point is order. The universe is not random. The heavenly bodies keep appointed paths. Days, months, and seasons follow rules set by God. And when human beings or angels defy the order assigned to them, disorder spreads below. Then there are the dream visions, where Enoch receives symbolic visions of history. Humanity appears in the form of animals. Nations become bulls, sheep, wolves, birds, and wild beasts. The past is transformed into a strange symbolic landscape, leading from Adam and Noah toward later crises in Israel's history. There is also the Epistle of Enoch, a collection of warnings, exhortations, and visions of coming judgment. It speaks to the righteous who suffer now and to the powerful who seem secure now, but will not remain secure forever. History, in these writings, bends toward reckoning. And there is the Book of Parables, sometimes called the Similitudes of Enoch. This section contains visions of heavenly judgment and a mysterious chosen figure, often called the Son of Man or the Chosen One. It is preserved in the later Ethiopic collection of 1 Enoch, though it was not found among the Aramaic Enoch manuscripts at Qumran. Scholars still debate what that absence means. Perhaps it was composed later. Perhaps it simply was not copied in the caves. With ancient manuscript evidence, absence can be suggestive, but it is rarely a final answer. Together, these writings turn Enoch into something remarkable. He is a patriarch, but not only a patriarch. He is a seer, a heavenly traveller, a keeper of knowledge that human beings were not supposed to have on their own. Sometimes he is called a scribe, writing down what he has seen for future generations. Sometimes he is an interpreter, explaining visions that terrify their dreamers. Sometimes he is a witness in a cosmic legal case, standing between rebellious angels and the God who judges them. This did not come from nowhere. Ancient readers had inherited those few lines from Genesis. Enoch walked with God. God took him. In a world where heaven was understood as a real realm above the visible sky, where angels served as messengers and stars could be seen as signs of divine order, that brief disappearance invited imagination. Where did Enoch go? What did he see? What did he learn? And if he knew the secrets of heaven, what would he say about the future of a violent world? The Enochic writings offered answers. Not one simple answer, but a whole tradition of answers. They explained evil by looking upward as well as downward. Human violence mattered, but so did heavenly rebellion. The world was broken not only because people made bad choices, but because beings from another realm had crossed into human life and brought destructive knowledge with them. It is a vast explanation for a small biblical mystery, and it gave the flood a new scale. In Genesis, the flood story is already enormous. The earth becomes corrupt. Violence fills the land. God decides to destroy what has been made, while Noah and his family are preserved. But in the Enochic imagination, the flood becomes part of a conflict that reaches into heaven itself. The violence of the giants, the sin of the watchers, the suffering of human beings, and the judgment of God all become connected. This is why the Book of Giants belongs in the Enochic world. It shares the same cast of cosmic characters: Enoch, watchers, giants, heavenly messages, judgment, the flood. But it is not simply another copy of the Book of Watchers. That distinction matters. The Book of Watchers is largely interested in the descent and punishment of the Watchers. It asks how heavenly beings rebelled, what forbidden teachings they brought, and why they cannot escape judgment. The giants are there, of course. Their appetite and violence help explain the catastrophe. But they are not always the emotional centre of the story. The Book of Giants shifts the angle. Its surviving fragments seem especially interested in the giant offspring themselves. Their names, their dreams, their fear, their attempts to understand what is happening to them. In this version of the larger Enochic drama, the monsters are not just a faceless army of destruction. They wake from troubling visions, they send messages, they seek Enoch's interpretation. They begin to realize that something vast and irreversible is coming. It is the same universe, but viewed from a different place. Imagine hearing the story of a war from a king's court, then hearing it from soldiers waiting in a ruined city, wondering whether the enemy has already crossed the river. The basic events may overlap, but the feeling changes. The questions change. The people at the centre change. That is what the Book of Giants seems to do with the old Enochic story. Before we meet its giants by name, Before Mahaway travels in search of answers, before the dreams become darker and the flood draws near, we need to look at the tiny biblical passage from which this entire tradition grew. Because beneath all the vast heavenly journeys, all the watchers, all the giants, and all the lost fragments, there is a sentence in Genesis so brief that it can be read in less than a minute, and it opened the door to everything. The passage is Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. 4 verses, depending on the translation, barely more than 100 words. And yet, these few lines generated one of the most elaborate stories in ancient Jewish literature. Genesis begins simply enough. Human beings are multiplying on the earth. Daughters are being born. Then the text says that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, choosing whomever they wished. Then comes a strange statement from God about human life being limited to 120 years. And then, almost as if it has changed subjects without warning, Genesis mentions the Nephilim. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, the passage says, when the sons of God went in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These children are called the mighty men of old, men of renown. And that is it. No names, no explanation of what the sons of God were, no description of the Nephilim, no account of a rebellion in heaven, no story of angels descending on a mountain, no giant dreams, no heavenly tablets, no imprisoned watchers waiting beneath the earth. Just 4 verses sitting between the long genealogies of Genesis and the flood of Noah. It is one of those passages that seems clear for about 5 seconds. Then you start asking questions. Who are the sons of God? Who are the daughters of men? Are the Nephilim the children born from these unions? Or are they a separate group already present on earth? The grammar has been argued over for centuries, and what does the name Nephilim even mean? Later Greek translations rendered it as giants, which is why giants became the familiar word in so many later traditions. But the Hebrew term may be connected to falling, perhaps meaning fallen ones, or perhaps it preserves an older name whose original meaning was already uncertain. Even the phrase men of renown is mysterious. It could suggest famous warriors, ancient heroes, powerful rulers, figures remembered from a distant age before the flood washed their world away. Genesis does not stop to tell us, and when a sacred text leaves a door half open, generations of readers often gather around it. Some later interpreters understood the sons of God as human beings. One famous explanation identified them with the descendants of Seth, the supposedly righteous line of Adam's son Seth, while the daughters of men were identified with descendants of Cain. In that reading, the problem was intermarriage between the godly and the ungodly, a breakdown of moral boundaries within humanity itself. Other interpreters saw the sons of God as kings or aristocrats. In the ancient Near East, rulers could be described with divine language. Perhaps these were powerful men who took women by force, building dynasties of violent warriors. The Nephilim, then, might have been legendary strongmen, the kind of ancient heroes whose names survived in stories long after their actual lives were forgotten. Those interpretations did not disappear. Variations of them remained important in Jewish and Christian reading for centuries, and they still have defenders today. But there was another interpretation, one that became central in the Enochic writings. The sons of God were not human. They were heavenly beings. In several parts of the Hebrew Bible, language like sons of God appears to refer to members of the divine court, beings who stand before God in heaven. The Book of Job, for example, describes the sons of God presenting themselves before the Lord. Psalms speak of heavenly beings in similar terms, so for ancient readers already familiar with that language, Genesis 6 could sound less like a story about human families and more like a boundary violation between heaven and earth. That is the reading embraced by the Book of Watchers. And once that reading takes hold, the tiny passage in Genesis becomes explosive. The sons of God become watchers, angelic beings assigned to observe the human world. The daughters of men become human women, caught in a disaster much larger than themselves. The Nephilim become giant offspring, immense and destructive. The vague mention of mighty men becomes the beginning of an age of violence so terrible that the flood becomes necessary. Genesis gives the outline. The Enochic tradition fills in the sky, the earth, the names, the crimes, and the sentence. It is worth pausing over how remarkable that process is. Ancient writers were not necessarily trying to replace Genesis. They were interpreting it, expanding its silences, asking what must have happened behind these compressed lines. Why does the flood story begin with this strange union? Why mention the Nephilim at all? Why introduce heavenly language at the exact moment human corruption is about to overwhelm the world? For the writers behind the Watcher traditions, these questions had an answer. The flood was not only a response to ordinary human wrongdoing. It was the aftermath of a cosmic breach. Beings who belonged above crossed into the human realm. They took what was not theirs to take. They taught knowledge that human beings were not ready to possess. Their children grew into creatures of enormous appetite and violence, and the earth, caught beneath the consequences, became corrupted. That is an interpretation, not something Genesis spells out in detail. The biblical passage remains brief enough to support competing readings. But the angelic interpretation was not invented from nothing. It drew on the phrase sons of God, on older ideas about heavenly courts, and on a widespread ancient sense that the visible human world was connected to an unseen world above it. And it gave ancient storytellers a way to explain evil on a scale that ordinary human sin alone could seem too small to contain. Why was the world so violent before the flood? Why did corruption spread so completely? Why did ancient memory preserve stories of beings who were greater, stronger, and more terrifying than ordinary people? The Watcher tradition answered, because heaven itself had failed to remain in heaven. From that answer came an entire literature. The Watchers received names. Their leader became Semihazah. Another figure, Asael, became associated with forbidden arts, weapons, adornment, and the knowledge that turned human skill toward destruction. Enoch became the messenger who carried judgment between heaven and earth, and the giants, barely glimpsed in Genesis, became characters with fears, families, dreams, and a terrible awareness that their world was approaching its end. It all grew from those 4 verses, a few lines about beautiful daughters, mysterious sons of God, and ancient mighty men. Then ancient readers looked closer, and in the space between the words they saw angels coming down. The story does not begin with a battle, it begins with a descent. In the Book of Watchers, the beings called the sons of God are given a new name, the Watchers. In Aramaic, the word is related to wakefulness, to being alert, watchful. They are heavenly beings, members of the divine order, creatures whose proper place is above the human world. And that detail matters. The problem is not simply that they desire human women. Ancient stories are full of gods, spirits, and heroes crossing strange boundaries. The deeper problem in the Enochic tradition is that the Watchers abandon their assigned place. They leave heaven, they enter the world below, they cross a line that was supposed to remain uncrossed. Think about the structure of the universe as these ancient writers imagined it. Heaven above, earth below, human beings living in the middle, vulnerable, mortal, limited by hunger, sickness, violence, and time. Above them are the holy ones, the angels, the heavenly court surrounding God. Each realm has its place, each has its limits. Then a group of heavenly beings decides that the limits do not apply to them. That is the first rebellion. Not a rebellion involving armies or flaming swords. Not yet. It is a rebellion of movement, a decision to come down. The Book of Watchers says that the angels saw the daughters of men and desired them. Genesis had already given ancient readers that much. But the later story slows the moment down and makes it far more deliberate. These beings do not merely fall by accident. They make a plan. Their leader worries that the others may hesitate. According to the story, he says something like this: "What if only I carry the blame for this great sin? What if all of you enjoy what follows, but when judgment comes, you leave me standing alone before heaven?" It is a very human concern, coming from an angelic being. So they swear an oath together. This collective oath is one of the most important details in the whole Watcher tradition. The angels bind themselves to one another before they descend. They make a mutual curse, a solemn agreement that none of them will turn back. No one gets to claim later that he was pressured. No one gets to say, "I only followed the others." They are all implicated. Every Watcher becomes responsible for the act. It is not temptation in a single careless moment. It is conspiracy. And for ancient audiences, an oath was not casual language. An oath created obligations with spiritual force. To swear together was to make the decision harder to escape. They were tying themselves to the crime before it had even been committed. That may be why the story feels so ominous. The disaster is already underway while the Watchers are still in heaven. The earth does not know it yet. The human women do not know it yet. But somewhere above, a group of heavenly beings has agreed to break the order of creation. Then they come down. The traditional landing place is Mount Hermon, a massive mountain range at the northern edge of ancient Israel, near the regions that are now Lebanon and Syria. Hermon rises dramatically over the surrounding landscape. In clear weather, its snowy heights can be seen from a great distance. It was a natural place for ancient imagination to locate a meeting between heaven and earth. High mountains often carry that kind of meaning. They seem to touch the sky. Storms gather around them, clouds hide their peaks. From below, they look like places where ordinary rules might weaken. But Hermon is not chosen randomly in the story. The name of the mountain was linked, at least by ancient interpreters, with the language of the oath or curse made by the Watchers. The angels descend there, gather there, and bind themselves there. The mountain becomes a kind of scar on the landscape, a place remembered not because a god appeared there in glory, but because heavenly beings arrived in defiance. Picture it, a mountain above the settled world, dark slopes, snow on the upper ridges, below human villages, fields, animals, smoke rising from cooking fires, people living ordinary lives, unaware that something has changed in the heavens. And on the mountain, beings who were supposed to watch have become participants. That is where desire enters the story. But desire is only part of it. The Watchers also bring knowledge. This is the detail that turns the story from a strange tale of forbidden unions into an explanation for why the world became violent. In the Book of Watchers, certain angels teach human beings arts that had previously belonged to the heavenly realm. They reveal metalworking, weapons, spells, astrology, signs in the sky, and forms of hidden knowledge. One tradition especially associates a Watcher called Asael with teaching people how to make swords, knives, shields, and armor. He also teaches adornment, jewelry, cosmetics, precious stones, and the arts of beautifying the body. To a modern reader, that list can feel strange. Why place makeup beside warfare? Why treat knowledge of the stars as dangerous? Why is craftsmanship part of a cosmic crime? Because the issue is not that every skill is evil. The issue is knowledge without moral limits, power arriving before wisdom, human beings gaining techniques that can magnify ambition, violence, manipulation, and desire. A blade can cut meat, shape wood, protect a family. It can also kill. Knowledge of the heavens can help people mark seasons and navigate the world. It can also become a way to claim secret power over fate. Adornment can be beauty, celebration, identity. It can also become, in the moral imagination of these ancient writers, part of a world where appearance, status and desire are turned into tools of corruption. The Watcher story is not a simple rejection of civilization. The writers who preserved it lived in literate societies. They copied books, studied calendars, debated law, and treated wisdom as a gift. But they feared knowledge detached from its proper source and purpose. They feared secrets given to human beings by rebellious angels, knowledge that does not make people wiser, but more dangerous, and that fear is central to the catastrophe ahead. The Watchers do not merely produce giant children, they transform the human world around them. Their teachings spread. Violence spreads with them. The earth fills with bloodshed, disorder and cries that rise upward toward heaven. The giants will become the most visible sign of that disorder. Huge, hungry, powerful, impossible to contain. But the roots of the disaster are already present on Mount Hermon. A forbidden descent, a shared oath, a breach between heaven and earth, and stolen knowledge placed into human hands. The giants have not fully entered the story yet, but their fate is already beginning to take shape, because once the Watchers cross the boundary, there is no simple return. The knowledge they reveal cannot be unrevealed. The children they father cannot be unborn, and the judgment that will one day fall on the giants begins, quietly, with angels standing together on a mountain and promising each other that they will disobey. The oath on Mount Hermon has a leader. In the Book of Watchers, that leader is usually called Semihazah, sometimes spelled Semihazah or Semihazah. Ancient texts moved between languages, scripts and copying traditions for centuries, so names do not always arrive in English wearing the same clothes. But behind those different spellings is the same figure, the Watcher who fears being left alone to bear the punishment, then persuades the others to bind themselves by oath. Semihazah is not necessarily the strongest angel in the story. He is something more recognizable. He is the organizer. He is the one who turns desire into a decision, and a decision into a conspiracy. A group of Watchers might have looked down at humanity with curiosity, envy, or longing. But under Semihazah, those scattered impulses become a shared act of rebellion. He makes sure they descend together. He makes sure no one can later step back and claim innocence. That is why his name matters. The Watchers are not presented as anonymous forces of chaos, like a storm or plague. They are individuals. They have names, ranks, responsibilities, and distinct forms of guilt. The disaster on earth is not random. It begins in heaven with persons making choices. And beside Semihazah stands another figure whose reputation became even darker, Asael. In some manuscripts and later retellings, his name appears in forms like Azazel. Scholars have debated the relationship between these names for a long time. Are they different spellings of the same being? Are they closely related figures whose stories became intertwined? The evidence is old, fragmentary, and not always consistent enough to give a simple answer. But the basic tradition is clear. Asael is associated with forbidden instruction. Semihazah leads the collective oath. Asael teaches the dangerous arts. The Book of Watchers says that Asael taught human beings to make swords, knives, shields, breastplates, and other instruments of war. He revealed the working of metals. He taught people about precious stones, ornaments, cosmetics, and ways of altering appearance. Other Watchers are assigned other kinds of secret knowledge, enchantments, astrology, signs of the clouds, the movements of the moon, the courses of the stars. It is almost like a catalogue of civilization's sharper edges. Metal becomes weapons. beauty becomes seduction or vanity. The sky becomes a source of forbidden calculation. Words become spells. None of this means that ancient Jews thought every craft worker, healer, astronomer or person wearing jewelry was serving evil. The world of the Dead Sea Scrolls was full of scribes, farmers, builders, healers, and people who watched the heavens closely to organize religious calendars. The problem was not knowledge by itself. The problem was stolen knowledge. Knowledge delivered across a forbidden boundary from rebellious heavenly beings to humans who were not ready to use it rightly. In this imagination, the arts taught by Asael are dangerous because they multiply human power. They give people new ways to dominate one another, to wage war, to manipulate desire, and to claim mastery over mysteries that belong to God. And then, according to the story, the world begins to break. There is another reason these names mattered so much. Ancient apocalyptic writing is full of named angels. Modern readers can sometimes find the lists exhausting. One name follows another, often with small differences between manuscripts. But for ancient audiences, these lists helped map the invisible world. They made heaven feel organized, populated, and morally accountable. Think about what a list of names does. It turns a vague accusation into an indictment. You're not saying that evil somehow drifted down from the sky. You are saying these beings did it? This leader gathered the others. This teacher revealed weapons. This angel taught a hidden art. Each name fixes responsibility in place. The names also suggest that heaven, like earth, has an order. There are watchers, messengers, holy ones, rebellious ones, leaders, followers, and judges. The universe is not empty above the clouds. It is a court, a kingdom, a hierarchy, and the watchers' crime is worse precisely because they belonged to that order before they betrayed it. The Book of Giants inherits this world, but it does not always tell the story in the same way. Its surviving fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls are not a complete book. They are broken pieces, often only a few lines long. Some preserve names clearly, others preserve only a few letters, enough to make scholars lean forward, compare handwriting, compare language, and argue carefully about what may once have stood there. The giant names are among the best known. Ohyah and Hahyah appear in the surviving tradition. Mahaway, the giant messenger who will soon go searching for Enoch, is another central figure. These are not the main characters of the Book of Watchers in the same way. The Book of Giants shifts the focus downward toward the children born from the Watchers' rebellion and toward their growing terror of judgment. But the old leaders remain in the background. Semihazah appears to belong to the Book of Giants cast as well, or at least to the same inherited network of stories. Asael too belongs unmistakably to the wider Watcher tradition that gave the Book of Giants its setting. Yet the damaged state of the evidence means we have to be precise. A name that seems obvious in a later translation may be incomplete in an Aramaic fragment. A character known from one Enoch may be assumed to be present where the surviving text does not firmly prove it. That uncertainty is not a failure of the story. It is part of the story's history. For more than 2,000 years, these texts survived as copies, translations, quotations, and scraps buried in desert caves. Names changed shape as Aramaic became Hebrew, Greek, Syriac, Persian, and other languages. Some figures gained new details, others faded into a few broken letters. But Semihazah and Asael endured because they represented two sides of the rebellion. Semihazah is the oath, the decision to cross the line together. Asael is the teaching, the release of power into the human world. And between those two acts, the ancient writers saw the beginning of a catastrophe. First, the angels rebel, then humanity receives knowledge it cannot control. Then the children of that union grow into something immense, violent and hungry. The leaders have made their choice. Now the giants must live with what that choice has created. And this is where the story becomes enormous. Not just morally enormous, physically enormous too. According to the tradition behind the Book of Giants, the union between the Watchers and human women produces children unlike ordinary human beings. These are the giants. In Genesis, the famous little passage calls them the Nephilim, a word that has generated arguments for centuries. In Greek translations they become giants. In the Book of Watchers, and even more vividly in the Book of Giants, they are not quiet descendants living at the edge of the story. They are the disaster made visible. The Watchers crossed a boundary between heaven and earth. The giants are what happens afterward. They are the living evidence that the order of creation has been disturbed. Heavenly beings were supposed to remain heavenly. Human beings were supposed to remain human. But now something new has appeared in the world, something too large, too powerful, and too hungry to fit inside its proper place. The Book of Watchers describes the giants in dramatic terms. They grow huge, they consume the labour and food of human beings. And when ordinary resources are no longer enough, they turn against humanity itself. They devour animals, then birds, then reptiles and fish. Eventually, the story says, they consume one another's flesh and drink blood. It is a nightmare of appetite, and ancient writers understood appetite as more than hunger. A giant who eats everything around him is not simply a creature with a large stomach. He represents desire without a limit, power that does not know when to stop, violence that keeps expanding because nothing inside it says enough. Imagine being a farmer in that world. You plant grain. You tend animals. You wait through the seasons for a harvest that has to feed your family until the next year. Then someone larger, stronger, and beyond any law takes it. Not once, but again and again, until there is nothing left. The giant tradition turns that familiar human fear into mythic scale. The powerful consume the weak. The land is stripped. The ordinary rules that make life possible collapse. And the earth itself cries out. That detail matters. In the Book of Watchers, the violence of the giants does not remain a human problem. The earth protests to heaven. Bloodshed has become so extensive that creation is treated almost like a witness in a court case. The ground has seen what happened. It has absorbed the blood. And now it calls for judgment. This is one of the oldest ideas in biblical and ancient Near Eastern literature. Violence stains the land. The world is not morally neutral. Human cruelty in this imagination leaves a mark on fields, rivers, cities, and soil. When the giants fill the earth with destruction, they do not merely break individual laws. They threaten the balance of the entire created order. That is why they are so frightening. But were ancient readers expected to picture literal beings of impossible size, towering over human villages like walking mountains? Possibly the texts certainly use the language of giant size, and later traditions often leaned into it. Some ancient versions give measurements so extreme that the giants seem less like biological creatures and more like forces of catastrophe. The numbers may be deliberately exaggerated, designed to make the point unmistakable. These beings are beyond ordinary human scale. Still, size may not be the whole point. In myth, enormous bodies often express enormous social danger. A giant can be the image of a king who takes too much, an army that crushes weaker communities, a violent ruling class, or the terrifying feeling that the world has become controlled by people too powerful to resist. The giants are physically oversized because their greed is oversized. Their violence is too large for ordinary justice to contain. That does not mean the ancient authors were secretly writing modern political allegory. we should not flatten an ancient supernatural story into a simple metaphor. They seem to have believed they were describing a real crisis in the deep history of the world, a crisis involving angels, humans, and divine judgment. But myths can do more than one thing at once. They can tell a story about the origins of evil, while also giving shape to fears that ordinary people knew very well. Hunger, war, exploitation, sexual disorder, the collapse of boundaries, the sense that the strong have become so strong that no one can hold them accountable. And in the Book of Giants, these terrifying figures begin to receive names. That is a surprising move. If the giants were only monsters, the story could leave them anonymous. A crowd of violent beings is enough to explain why the flood must come. But the surviving traditions preserve names that make them more individual, more complicated, and in a strange way, more tragic. Two of the most important are Ohyah and Hahyah. Their names appear in the Aramaic fragments from Qumran, though the damaged condition of the manuscripts means that many details remain uncertain. Later versions of the story, especially those preserved in Manichaean writings from Central Asia, also remember them. There they appear as prominent giants, often connected with dreams, fear, and the coming judgment. They are not merely eating machines at the edge of the tale. They speak, they worry, they try to understand what is happening. This is one of the Book of Giants' most unusual contributions to the larger Enoch tradition. The Book of Watchers spends much of its attention on the fallen angels and on Enoch's journeys through the heavens. The Book of Giants turns and looks at the children of the rebellion. It asks what it would feel like to be born into a world already under sentence. Ohyah and Hahyah inherit strength, violence, and a terrifying origin. But they also inherit uncertainty. They do not control the judgment that is coming. They may not even fully understand why their dreams have become so disturbing. Somewhere beyond their reach, heaven has already begun considering their case. And then there is Mahaway, sometimes spelled Mahaway. Mahaway becomes one of the most memorable figures in the whole surviving story. He is a giant, but he is not introduced mainly as a destroyer. He is a messenger. That role is almost ironic. The giants exist because communication between heaven and earth was violated. The Watchers brought forbidden knowledge down to humanity. But when the giants need knowledge, when they need to know what their dreams mean, and whether they can escape their fate, they cannot simply take an answer by force. They have to seek one. Mahaway is sent to find Enoch. The exact family relationships are not always clear in the broken Aramaic evidence, and later retellings do not always agree on every detail. But the basic shape of the episode survives. Mahaway travels to Enoch, the human sage who moves between earthly and heavenly realms more freely than anyone else in these stories. He is asked to bring back an interpretation, a message, perhaps some hope. Think about that reversal. The giants are stronger than humans. Their fathers came from heaven. They have filled the world with terror. Yet when the future closes in, they need help from an old human scribe. And the person they seek is Enoch, the same Enoch who walked with God, the same Enoch who knows the hidden places of heaven, the same Enoch who has already become, in these traditions, a witness against the Watchers and a messenger of their punishment. Mahaway's journey does not make the giants innocent. The traditions never let us forget the violence surrounding them, but it gives the story a different emotional texture. These beings are monstrous, yes, but they are also afraid. They have begun to realize that being enormous is not the same as being secure. Their bodies may dominate the earth, but they cannot dominate time. They cannot eat away a decree from heaven. They cannot fight a flood before it arrives. And they cannot force Enoch to tell them that everything will be all right, because it will not. The giants have entered the story as symbols of disorder, appetite, and violence. But soon they will become something even more unsettling. They will become creatures who dream of their own end. So Mahaway goes. The surviving fragments do not give us a smooth travel story from beginning to end. They give us pieces, a name, a command, a journey, a meeting, a message carried back to giants who are waiting for an answer they may already fear. But even in pieces, the scene is powerful. Mahaway is sent out because the giants have dreamed dreams that disturb them. Something has appeared to them in the night, something involving destruction, judgment, and the end of their strength. They do not yet have the full interpretation. They know only that the visions feel wrong, heavy, impossible to dismiss when morning comes. And so they choose Mahaway. In the Qumran Aramaic fragments, Mahaway is a traveller, a messenger moving between the threatened world of the giants and the distant figure of Enoch. Later Manichaean versions preserve the episode in fuller form, though they come from a very different religious setting and were written centuries later. Scholars use them carefully. They may preserve old traditions missing from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they may also expand, reshape, and interpret the story in new ways. Still, both the earlier fragments and the later retellings agree on the basic point. Mahaway goes to Enoch because Enoch can explain what the giants cannot understand. This is not a small thing. The giants are supposed to be the strongest beings on earth. They are born from the union of heavenly watchers and human women. Their fathers possess secret knowledge. They have taught humanity the arts of war, metalworking, enchantments, astrology, and other forbidden skills. The whole world has been changed by knowledge that came down from heaven before it was meant to. But now, when the giants face a mystery of their own, all that power is useless. They have dreams, and they need an interpreter. In some reconstructed passages, Mahaway's journey seems almost supernatural. He travels across great distances, perhaps flying, perhaps moving with a speed beyond ordinary human ability. One later version has him describe himself as flying with his hands like an eagle. It is a strange image, a giant, enormous and dangerous, crossing the world not as a conqueror but as a frightened messenger. He is not going to seize Enoch. He is going to ask. That reversal is at the heart of the scene. Earlier in the story, the Watchers descend from heaven because they want something. They take human women. They reveal knowledge that does not belong to them to reveal. Their movement is downward, forceful, transgressive. They cross the boundary between heaven and earth because they believe they can do so. Mahaway's journey moves in the opposite moral direction. He seeks wisdom rather than stealing it. He approaches the righteous seer rather than breaking into the hidden places of heaven. And he does not arrive with certainty. He arrives with a question. That makes Mahaway more than a faceless monster. The Book of Giants never becomes sentimental about the giants. It does not forget the violence, the ruined earth, or the judgment that is approaching. These are not misunderstood heroes who only need to be accepted. They belong to a world corrupted by rebellion and bloodshed. But Mahaway gives that world a human, or almost human, moment. He is afraid of what he does not know. He has been sent by beings powerful enough to terrify ordinary people, yet he must stand before Enoch, an old human sage, and wait for words. In the logic of the story, strength has reached its limit. Size has reached its limit. Even ancestry has reached its limit. The giants may have heavenly fathers, but they do not possess heavenly understanding. Enoch does. That is why Enoch is such an important figure in this entire tradition. He is not a warrior. He does not defeat the giants with a weapon. He does not challenge their strength with greater strength. His authority comes from access to the divine order of things. He knows that the world is not ruled by whoever is biggest, hungriest, or most violent. There is a court above the earth. There are records, judgments, messengers, and decrees. And Enoch has seen enough of that hidden world to understand what the giants' dreams are telling them. Imagine Mahaway arriving at the place where Enoch is said to be. The texts do not let us fill in every detail with confidence. We do not know exactly what landscape the earliest version imagined, or how literal ancient readers understood the journey. But the emotional shape is clear enough. Behind Mahaway are the giants, waiting. Before him is Enoch, the one person who may know. Mahaway carries the anxiety of an entire doomed generation. He has to ask questions that no giant wants answered. What did the dreams mean? Is destruction coming? Is there a way out? Has heaven already decided? And perhaps the most terrible question of all is the simplest one. Are we finished? There is something almost tragic about this. The Watchers once brought forbidden knowledge into the human world, treating divine secrets as something they could distribute without consequence. But their children are now desperate for one kind of knowledge they cannot obtain, knowledge of their own future. They want certainty. They want a loophole. They want Enoch to say that dreams are only dreams. But ancient dream stories rarely work that way. A dream in this kind of literature is not random noise from the sleeping mind. It is a crack in the wall between worlds. It is a message, often symbolic, sometimes obscure, but carrying truth from beyond ordinary sight. The giants have seen something through that crack. Mahaway has come to ask Enoch to name it, and when Enoch answers, the story will move from fear to judgment. Enoch's answer is not comforting. That much seems clear from the surviving pieces, even where the exact wording has been lost. Mahaway comes seeking interpretation, perhaps hoping that a wise man can turn a terrible dream into something manageable. A warning, maybe, a problem with a solution. But Enoch does not offer the giants a strategy for escape. He explains the dreams as signs of a judgment already moving toward them. In the ancient world, dreams could be many things. They could come from ordinary human anxiety. They could be deceptive. They could be meaningless. But in Jewish apocalyptic writings like the Enochic books, certain dreams belong to another category entirely. They are messages from the hidden structure of the universe. They reveal what heaven has decided before earth has experienced it. And that is exactly what makes the giants' dreams so frightening. They have not merely dreamed of danger, they have glimpsed the future of their own world. The Book of Giants survives in fragments, so scholars cannot reconstruct every image with complete confidence. Some dream material is preserved more fully in later Manichaean versions, copied and adapted centuries after the Qumran texts. Those later accounts must be handled carefully. They are not a perfect window into the original book, but they preserve a pattern that fits the older fragments remarkably well. The giants dream of destruction. They dream of water. They dream of trees cut down, uprooted, or swept away. They dream of a few survivors escaping the ruin while the larger world disappears. To an ancient audience, these were not random symbols pulled from a sleeping mind. They were a disaster written in images. A tree is life. It has roots in the earth, branches in the sky, strength, age, and apparent permanence. A great tree can look almost invincible. It survives storms. It outlives generations. It provides shade, fruit, wood, and shelter. In symbolic dream language, a tree can stand for a family, a kingdom, a people, or a powerful individual. So when a dream shows mighty trees falling, it is not really about forestry. It is about power that thought it would last. The giants are exactly that kind of power. They are huge, violent, born from an impossible union between heaven and earth. Their fathers are watchers, beings who crossed a boundary they were not supposed to cross. Their whole existence seems to challenge the normal order of creation. If anyone might imagine themselves like the tallest trees in the forest, it would be them. But in the dreams, even the great trees are brought down. Then there is the water. Water can mean life in the ancient Near East. Rain makes crops grow. Springs sustain settlements. Rivers connect cities and carry trade. But water can also mean chaos. The sea is deep, dark, unstable, and dangerous. Floodwater does not negotiate. It does not care how strong you are, how old your bloodline is, or what secrets your father taught you. It rises, and once it rises, everything built on the ground discovers how temporary it was. For the Book of Giants, water points toward the flood that is approaching. Not simply a natural catastrophe, but a divine response to a world filled with violence and corruption. The giants have helped create that world. Their hunger devastates the earth. Their fathers spread forbidden teachings. Human society has become tangled up in a rebellion that began in heaven and now poisons life below. The dreams tell them that the whole structure is about to collapse, and somewhere within that destruction appears survival. This is the detail that makes the dreams more than simple nightmares. The visions do not show every living thing erased. They show a remnant, a small number preserved while the great ones fall. Later traditions connect these images clearly with Noah and the flood story. The giants see devastation coming, but they also see that someone will live through it. Think about how cruel that must have felt. They are the giants, the strongest creatures in the story, yet their dreams show that survival will not belong to the strongest. It will belong to those chosen to endure. That is Enoch's message. The dreams are not asking the giants to become better interpreters. They are telling the giants that their time is ending. And Enoch is the one who can read the message because he occupies a very unusual role in these traditions. He is a human being, but not an ordinary one. In Genesis, Enoch is introduced only briefly. He walks with God, and then he is gone. The Enochic literature turns that silence into a vast story. Enoch travels through heavenly places. He sees angels, cosmic prisons, places of punishment, and the machinery of the stars. He receives visions. He carries messages. He is also a scribe. That matters. A scribe records what has been spoken, preserves decrees, and gives fixed form to words that might otherwise vanish. In the Book of Watchers, Enoch writes petitions and messages connected to the fallen angels. In the Book of Giants, he stands again at the boundary between the heavenly court and the doomed earth. The giants have dreams. Mahaway carries the question. Enoch supplies the interpretation. Then the interpretation becomes a warning. This is what drives the surviving plot of the Book of Giants. Not a battle, not a heroic quest, not even the flood itself, at least not yet. The tension comes from knowledge. The giants learn what is coming before it comes. They are given the terrible privilege of understanding their fate. And there is no indication that heavenly knowledge saves them. That is one of the book's deepest ideas. The Watchers possess knowledge humans were not meant to have. They know heavenly mysteries. They teach weapons, spells, the reading of signs, perhaps the courses of the stars. Their descendants inherit unusual power and an unusual place in the world. But none of it protects them from judgment. Knowing secrets is not the same as being righteous. In fact, the book suggests the opposite can happen. Knowledge without wisdom becomes another form of corruption. Power without restraint becomes violence. Access to heaven does not make the Watchers faithful to heaven's order. It makes their rebellion worse, because they should have known better. And the giants learn this too late. Before we go further into the dreams themselves, a small note for anyone who enjoys these strange gaps in history. The channel's book explores 12 unexplained mysteries, from lost texts and ancient discoveries to questions that still resist easy answers. You can find it through the website link in the description. Because the Book of Giants is exactly that kind of mystery. A shattered text, a story reconstructed from scraps. A world where monsters dream that the flood is coming, and an ancient scribe tells them that the dreams are true. The next fragments preserve those dreams in more detail, and they are stranger than you might expect. Now the dream passes from Mahaway to two other giants, brothers named Ohyah and Hahyah. Their names survive in the broken Aramaic texts from Qumran, and they appear again in later versions of the story preserved far to the east, in Manichaean writings from Central Asia. The spellings change a little as the tale moves between languages. Ohyah can become Ohyah, Ohyah can become Hahyah, but the brothers remain recognizable. They are sons of the Watcher Semihazah, one of the leaders of the heavenly rebellion. That detail matters because these are not minor figures standing at the edge of the disaster. They belong to the ruling family of the giants. Their father helped bring the Watchers down from heaven. He helped establish the forbidden union between angels and human women. He is part of the generation that acted as though heavenly rank placed it beyond consequence. Ohyah and Hahyah inherit that world. They inherit the strength of the giants, the authority of their father, the terrible privileges of a bloodline that joins heaven and earth. And then they begin to dream. The exact division of the dream scenes between the brothers is not always certain. The Qumran manuscript pieces are too damaged to give us a complete, uninterrupted account. Later Manichaean texts preserve fuller narratives, but they were copied and reshaped long after the original Aramaic book was written. So historians have to be careful here. We cannot pretend that every surviving line comes directly from the same first edition of the Book of Giants. But the central picture is hard to miss. One of the brothers sees a vast garden. In it stand many great trees, not saplings, not brush that can be crushed underfoot. These are the dominant things in the landscape, rooted deeply, rising high, filling the garden with their branches. Then a heavenly being descends, and the trees are destroyed. In some versions, nearly all are uprooted, cut down, or swept away. Only a few remain. 3 roots or 3 shoots are left alive, while the rest of the garden is reduced to ruin. It is an image of judgment, but not a simple one. The garden is not merely destroyed by weather or time. It is inspected, measured, deliberately brought down. The dream suggests that someone from above has entered the giant world and decided that its great powers no longer deserve to stand. For Ohyah and Hahyah, the meaning would have been almost impossible to ignore. Their father and his fellow watchers had descended from heaven. They came down on their own terms, swearing an oath together and taking what they wanted from the human world. Now, in the dream, another figure comes down from heaven. But this visitor does not join the rebellion. He ends it. That reversal is devastating. The Watchers had treated descent from heaven as an act of power. The dream turns it into an act of judgment. Heaven has not forgotten what happened. Heaven is answering. And then there is the number of trees. Some later accounts speak of 200 trees, a number that echoes the 200 Watchers who descended in the Book of Watchers. Scholars cannot be entirely certain how tightly every version of this number connects to the original Qumran text. But it is probably not an accident. Ancient apocalyptic stories often work through these kinds of symbolic correspondences. 200 Watchers descend. 200 trees stand in the garden. Then the trees fall. The dream does not need to say, "Your fathers will be judged," in plain language. It shows the judgment in a form the giants cannot escape. Their family, their army, their entire unnatural order is like a forest that has grown too high and too violent. And the axe is already coming down. Another dream image appears alongside this destruction, water rising over the earth. Not a local flood, not a river breaking its banks after a season of rain. This is water on a cosmic scale, the kind that erases boundaries between field and road, house and wilderness, kingdom and grave. For creatures who seem physically unstoppable, this is a particularly terrible vision. A giant can defeat a human opponent. He can seize food, tear down walls, dominate a battlefield. But what does strength mean against water that covers the ground itself? There is nowhere to stand. The dreams strip away the giant's greatest advantage. Their size becomes meaningless. Their lineage becomes meaningless. Even their connection to the Watchers becomes meaningless. The flood is not something they can overpower, because it is not simply an enemy arriving from outside. It is the world becoming unlivable, and this is where the brothers' fear becomes so important. Their Watcher fathers are usually presented as confident, almost arrogantly confident. They make a pact. They reveal forbidden knowledge. They take wives, they create a new order without asking whether heaven permits it. Even when judgment approaches, the Watcher's story is one of rebellion against limits. But Ohyah and Hahyah are different. They are frightened. They do not interpret their dreams as signs of a clever enemy they can outmaneuver. They are confused by them. They send for Mahaway. They seek Enoch. They want someone to explain what they have seen because the dreams have opened a crack in their certainty. That crack is the whole point. The sons of the rebels discover that they are not masters of the story. They are characters inside a sentence already being written elsewhere. And notice what the dreams do not provide. They do not offer the giants instructions for building a vessel. They do not reveal a hidden mountain where they can wait out the waters. They do not give them a weapon capable of fighting heaven. The surviving traditions mention survivors, but the survivors are not the giant brothers. The remnant belongs to another line, another future. The dreams are warnings, not escape plans. That is a difficult kind of knowledge to receive. It is like being shown a door closing in the distance, then realizing you are not standing on the side where it will remain open. Even in Fragments, the emotional atmosphere survives. We can still feel the panic moving through the giant household. Brothers wake troubled. Messengers travel. Questions are carried across the wilderness to Enoch. Great beings who had seemed invulnerable suddenly need interpretation from a human scribe. And Enoch's answer leaves them with the one thing they did not want. Not uncertainty. Certainty. The garden will fall. The water will come. The power of the giants will collapse. And the next part of the story asks what happens when heaven's sentence finally reaches the earth. The sentence finally reaches the earth in the form the dreams had promised. Water in Genesis. The flood story is told with extraordinary economy. Human wickedness has become great. Violence fills the earth. God decides that the created world must be judged, while Noah and his family are preserved inside the ark. The giants appear only briefly in that biblical account. Genesis mentions the Nephilim, beings associated with the days before the flood, and then moves on. It does not stop to tell us their names. It does not describe their dreams. It does not explain exactly how they were connected to the disaster about to come. But the Enochic tradition does stop. It looks at that small, strange passage in Genesis and asks a larger question. What kind of world required a flood? Its answer is a world thrown out of balance by the Watchers and their children. In the Book of Watchers, the fallen angels do more than take human wives. They teach forbidden arts. They reveal secrets that were not meant for human beings. Weapons, spells, the cutting of roots, the reading of signs in the sky, the arts of beautification and war, knowledge itself becomes dangerous because it has been given without wisdom, without restraint, and without permission. Then the giants are born, and their hunger becomes one of the signs that the world has gone wrong. The Book of Watchers says that the giants consume the labour of human beings. When that is no longer enough, they turn against humanity itself. They consume animals, then living creatures, then one another. The language is deliberately horrifying. These are not merely powerful rulers collecting tribute from weaker people. They are appetite without limit. The earth in this story cries out. That is an important difference from Genesis. Genesis puts the emphasis on human corruption. The violence belongs to humanity as a whole. The flood comes because the earth is full of it. The Enochic books do not necessarily deny human responsibility, but they widen the frame. Human violence has been intensified by a heavenly rebellion. The Watchers corrupt the world from above. Their giant offspring ravage it from below. Heaven, earth, angels, humans, animals, all the proper boundaries of creation have been crossed, and so judgment has to be equally large. Not a punishment for one village. Not a defeat for one king. A flood for the giants. This is the end foretold in the dreams of Ohyah and Hahyah. The trees fall, the waters rise, the enormous bodies that seem to dominate the earth discover that no body is large enough to resist a world covered in water. But the Enochic sentence is more complicated than simply, everyone dies. The giants and the Watchers are punished in different ways because their crimes are different. The giants are creatures of earth and heaven joined together in an unlawful birth. They have acted violently on earth, and their destruction comes in the earthly catastrophe. In the Book of Watchers, God commands angels to turn the giant offspring against one another. They are to destroy each other in battle before the flood completes the devastation. There is something grimly fitting about that punishment. The giants made violence their way of life. In the end, violence consumes them. Their strength does not save them. Their family line does not save them. Their father's heavenly origin does not save them. The beings who seemed like the masters of the human world are reduced to victims of the same chaos they helped create. The Watchers, however, are not simply swept away with their children. They are imprisoned in the Book of Watchers. The angel Asael is bound and cast into darkness, confined in a desolate place until the final judgment. Semihazah and the other Watchers are also bound, forced to witness the ruin of their offspring. Their punishment is not immediate death. It is captivity, shame, and the knowledge that the world they helped corrupt has been destroyed. This is one of the coldest details in the entire tradition. The Watchers came down because they desired human life. They wanted wives, they wanted children, they wanted to cross the boundary between heaven and earth. Their punishment is to lose both worlds. They cannot return freely to heaven. They cannot remain among humans, and they cannot protect the giant sons whose birth came from their rebellion. Now, how much of this appears directly in the Book of Giants? That question matters. The surviving Aramaic fragments from Qumran clearly preserve giants, dreams, messengers, Enoch's warning, and an approaching judgment. They preserve names like Mahaway, Ohyah, and Hahyah. They preserve the atmosphere of fear before destruction. But they do not give us one complete, surviving scene of the flood, swallowing the giants, or a full courtroom account of the Watchers being bound. Those details are supplied most fully by related Enochic works, especially the Book of Watchers, and by later versions of the giant story. So the Book of Giants should not be treated as though it were simply a damaged copy of the Book of Watchers. It is its own story. Its special focus is not the mechanics of the flood. It is what the sentence feels like from inside the doomed family. It lets us hear the giants asking questions before the waters come. It shows their fear, their confusion, their desperate attempt to obtain an answer from Enoch. The Book of Watchers gives us the cosmic legal case. The Book of Giants gives us the panic in the defendant's house. And then later tradition adds one more unsettling idea. According to a passage in 1 Enoch, when the giants die, something remains. Because they were born from both spirits and flesh, their dead bodies perish on earth, but their spirits continue as harmful spirits. These spirits wander the world, afflicting human beings, causing trouble, violence, and disease. This is not a detail directly preserved in the main Book of Giants, Fragments from Qumran. It belongs to the wider Enochic world, but it became enormously influential. It offered an explanation for why the flood, despite being so total, did not erase evil forever. The bodies of the giants were gone, but their spirits remained. In later Jewish and Christian traditions, this idea helped shape the concept of demons, wandering, hostile beings connected to an ancient catastrophe, hungry for the world they no longer possess. It is a haunting ending. The flood cleanses the earth, but it does not make history simple. The Watchers remain bound, awaiting a final judgment. The giants are destroyed, but their memory survives. And perhaps in the imagination of later readers, something of their violence survives too, moving invisibly through the world. The waters recede. Noah's world begins again. But beneath that new beginning lies the memory of an older world, one ruled by rebellious angels, frightened giants, and a sentence that no strength could escape. But who gives that sentence? In these ancient stories, judgment does not rise out of the earth by itself. It comes from above. The Book of Giants survives only in pieces, but those pieces belong to a much larger universe. A universe with levels. God stands at the highest level, distant, sovereign, the ultimate source of judgment. Below him are angels, messengers, holy beings who carry out commands, deliver decrees, bind rebels, interpret visions, and move between the regions of heaven and earth. Then there are the Watchers. The name itself tells us what they were supposed to do. They were watchers, heavenly beings assigned, in some sense, to observe the human world. In later traditions, watchers can be protective, instructive, even benevolent. But in the Enochic story, a group of them abandons its proper place. They come down, and that descent changes everything. The Watchers are not presented as rivals equal to God. They are powerful, but they are not ultimate. They can teach forbidden knowledge. They can take human wives. They can father giant children. They can corrupt the earth on a catastrophic scale. But they cannot erase the structure of the cosmos. That is the central tension in the story. Rebellion is real. It causes suffering. It destabilizes the human world. But it does not overthrow heaven. The Watchers cross a boundary. Then the giants are born across another boundary. And the whole disaster unfolds because creation, in this imagination, depends on things remaining where they belong. Heavenly beings belong in heaven. Human beings belong on earth. Knowledge has its proper time and proper limits. Even power has limits. The giants do not understand this, at least not at first. They seem to have grown up inside the consequences of a rebellion they did not begin. Their fathers came from heaven. Their mothers came from earth. They are enormous, violent, feared, and yet when the dreams begin, when the messages become clear, they are helpless. That helplessness matters. A giant may be able to terrify human beings. He may be stronger than any ordinary warrior, but he cannot simply march into heaven and demand an answer. So Mahaway goes looking for one. He travels to Enoch, and Enoch, unlike the giants, can speak across the divide. This is one of the most remarkable things about Enoch in these traditions. In Genesis, he is only briefly mentioned. He walks with God, and then he is gone, because God takes him. That is almost all the biblical text says, but later Jewish writers looked at that tiny passage and saw a mystery. Where did Enoch go? What did he see? What kind of person could be taken from the human world into the presence of God? The Enochic books answer by turning him into a traveller between realms. Not exactly an angel, not merely an ordinary human being either. He remains human, but he is granted access to heavenly knowledge. He sees visions, he receives warnings, he writes messages. He is shown the hidden architecture of the universe. Places of punishment, movements of stars, chambers of wind, storehouses of snow, and the future judgment of rebels. In the Book of Giants, this makes Enoch uniquely important. The giants need someone who can interpret what is happening to them. Their dreams are not just strange pictures in the night. They are heavenly communications. They carry a verdict. And in the ancient world, a verdict was not always delivered in the language of private feelings. It came as a decree. A decree is formal, public, irreversible. Kings issued decrees, empires issued decrees, courts issued decrees. Once the words were written and sealed, they were no longer merely advice. They were law moving through the world. The Book of Giants uses this kind of language because its judgment is imagined as a heavenly legal decision. The giants are not just unlucky victims of an approaching natural disaster. Their destruction has been decided in the court of heaven. That does not necessarily mean we should picture one fixed, detailed courtroom scene behind every fragment. Ancient Jewish apocalyptic literature was not one uniform system with a single map of heaven. Different texts describe different numbers of heavens, different angelic ranks, different names, and different roles for heavenly beings. Sometimes God is portrayed as speaking directly. Sometimes angels act as interpreters. Sometimes a visionary is brought before a throne. Sometimes the heavenly world remains almost entirely hidden. But across these differences, one idea keeps returning. The universe is governed, not always peacefully, not always in ways human beings can understand, but governed. The rebellion of the Watchers is frightening precisely because it threatens that order. They take what does not belong to them. They reveal knowledge outside its proper boundaries. They create children who do not fit easily into the established categories of heaven or earth. The giants then magnify the disorder through hunger, violence, and domination. The flood is therefore not only a punishment, it is a restoration. A brutal restoration. Certainly a restoration carried out through catastrophe. But within the logic of these stories, the world has become so distorted that ordinary correction is no longer enough. This is why angels appear so often around the edges of the narrative. They are not decorative figures with wings standing silently in the background. They are the machinery of cosmic order. They carry messages. They execute sentences. They restrain what has become dangerous. They mark the difference between a world ruled by appetite and a world ruled by decree. And Enoch stands in the middle. He is close enough to humanity to receive the giant's fear. But he is close enough to heaven to understand the answer. He does not save them. That is important. His role is not to negotiate a loophole in the sentence. In the wider Enochic tradition, even the Watchers ask him to intercede for them. And the answer is devastatingly clear. Their petition will not be accepted. Enoch can carry messages. He cannot cancel judgment. That makes him less like a magician and more like a scribe. He records what has been seen, heard, and decided. He turns terrifying visions into words, and those words travel back down into the world where giants, Watchers, and eventually human readers must confront them. So the heavenly court is not distant background material. It is the hidden centre of the story, the giant's dream because heaven has spoken. Mahaway seeks Enoch because heaven is difficult to reach. The Watchers are bound because heaven has limits, and the flood comes because, in this ancient imagination, cosmic order cannot survive if rebellion is allowed to become the normal state of the world. But the Book of Giants tells that enormous cosmic story from an unusual angle. Not from the throne, not from the angels carrying chains, but from below among the doomed descendants of the rebellion, listening for the answer that has already been written. And that unusual angle is the key to understanding what the Book of Giants is and what it is not. Because at first glance, the Book of Giants can look like a lost section of 1 Enoch. The same strange world is there. The Watchers come down from heaven. Human women become involved in the story. Giant offspring appear on earth. Enoch receives heavenly knowledge. Judgment approaches. The flood waits somewhere beyond the horizon. It can feel like you have opened a familiar book and found several pages torn from the middle. But that picture is misleading. The Book of Giants is not simply a missing chapter that somebody removed from the Book of Watchers. It is not a secret continuation hidden behind the pages of 1 Enoch. And it is not, as far as the surviving evidence shows, a complete Enochic book that later editors accidentally forgot to include. Instead, it seems to be a related work, a separate composition built from the same mythic materials. Same world, same catastrophe, same heavenly rebellion, but a different story about where to stand when the judgment comes. Think of it like 2 ancient storytellers describing the same disaster. One stands on the mountain, looking down at the whole landscape. He sees the rebellion begin. He sees the Watchers make their oath. He sees forbidden knowledge spread among human beings. He sees the earth fill with violence. Then he sees heaven respond. That is broadly the perspective of the Book of Watchers, the first major section of 1 Enoch. The other storyteller stands in the valley, much closer to the giants themselves. He hears their arguments. He watches them wake from terrible dreams. He follows Mahaway as he searches for Enoch. He listens as the doomed descendants of the Watchers try to understand what heaven has decided. That is the Book of Giants. The 2 works share important characters. Enoch appears in both as the human figure who can receive messages from the heavenly world. The Watchers appear in both as rebellious beings who cross the boundary between heaven and earth. The giants appear in both as the disastrous offspring of that crossing. And judgment hangs over everyone involved, the Watchers, the giants, and the corrupted world below them. But sharing characters does not make 2 works identical. Ancient literature did not always operate the way modern franchises do. There was no central publishing office deciding the official version of the Watcher Rebellion. Stories could move through communities, be copied, expanded, shortened, translated and retold from new perspectives. A famous figure like Enoch could become the centre of many writings without all those writings being chapters of 1 master book. And Enoch was especially suited to this kind of expansion. Genesis gives only a few lines about him. He walked with God. Then he was gone, because God took him. That small mystery created a huge opening. Later writers could imagine Enoch seeing things no ordinary human had seen. The courses of the stars, the places of the dead, the prison of fallen angels, the decrees of heaven, the future of the world. Once Enoch becomes a heavenly scribe and messenger, many stories can gather around him. The Book of Watchers uses him to explain the origin of corruption. Why is the world violent? Why do human beings possess dangerous arts? Why are there giants in the old stories? Its answer is cosmic. A group of Watchers rebelled. They came down. They taught forbidden things. Their children became monstrous consumers and destroyers. The flood becomes the answer to a world bent out of shape. The Book of Giants does not reject that framework. It assumes it, but it slows down at a different moment. What does it feel like to be one of the giants after the sentence has been announced? That is where the fragments become unexpectedly human, even though their characters are anything but ordinary. Ohyah and Hahyah dream. They worry. They debate what the dreams mean. Mahaway goes on a journey because uncertainty has become unbearable. The giants are still dangerous figures in the larger story, but they are no longer just a faceless mass of devourers waiting for the flood. They have names, they have fear, they have the terrible awareness that something is coming, and that they may not be able to stop it. This does not make the Book of Giants a story of redemption. The surviving fragments do not show the giants escaping their fate. Enoch's message is not comforting. The decree remains a decree. Judgment is still moving toward them, but the focus changes. In the Book of Watchers, the giants are often part of the evidence against the rebellion. They are consequences of the Watchers' descent. They consume, they destroy, and they help explain why the earth cries out for judgment. In the Book of Giants, they become listeners to their own condemnation. That is a much more intimate kind of horror. Imagine learning that the end of your world has already been written down somewhere beyond your reach. Imagine sending a messenger to the one person who can read the writing. Imagine waiting for him to return, hoping the dream means something else, hoping there has been a mistake, hoping that heaven might still be persuaded, and then receiving an answer that confirms the fear. That emotional centre is one reason scholars usually treat the Book of Giants and the Book of Watchers as distinct, though closely connected compositions. They overlap too deeply to be unrelated. Their shared names, themes, and assumptions point to an Enochic tradition in which the Watcher rebellion and the coming flood were already well known. But they organise that tradition differently. The Book of Watchers gives us the architecture of the rebellion, the descent, the oath, the forbidden teachings, the heavenly sentence. The Book of Giants gives us a drama unfolding inside the ruins of that architecture. It asks what happens when the children of cosmic disorder discover that cosmic order is coming back. There may also have been older shared traditions behind both books, stories told and retold before either work reached the form we can recognize. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserve fragments, not a neat literary family tree. So, scholars cannot always say exactly which version came first, or precisely how one text influenced another. But the basic point is clear. These are not duplicates. They are companion stories. One tells us why the flood had to come. The other lets us sit with those who heard it coming first. But the story did not end in the caves above the Dead Sea. In fact, one of the strangest things about the Book of Giants is that its surviving trail does not simply lead from ancient Judea into a library of Jewish writings where it waits quietly beside the Book of Watchers and the Book of Jubilees. It leads east, far east, from the Aramaic fragments found at Qumran. The trail eventually reaches Mesopotamia, Iran, Central Asia, and the oasis towns along the Silk Road. It reaches communities that spoke languages most of the Qumran scribes would never have heard. Middle Persian, Parthian, Sogdian, later, even Old Uyghur. And the people preserving the story were not Jewish sectarians living beside the Dead Sea. They were Manichaeans now. Mani was a religious teacher who lived in 3rd century Mesopotamia, roughly 600 years after many scholars think the Book of Giants was first composed. He was born around the year 216, in a world where Roman, Persian, Jewish, Christian, Babylonian, and Iranian religious ideas all met and collided. Mani did not present himself as the founder of a completely isolated religion. He presented himself as part of a chain. He saw figures like Buddha, Zoroaster, and Jesus as earlier messengers of truth, each bringing revelation to a particular people and time. Mani believed that his own mission completed and clarified that earlier teaching. His religion, Manichaeism, built a vast cosmic story around the struggle between light and darkness, spirit and matter, the divine world above and the broken world below. It was a religion with missionaries, and that mattered. The community at Qumran copied texts for itself. Its library was buried, probably during the chaos of the Roman war, and then left hidden in the desert for nearly 2,000 years. But Manichaean communities carried writings outward. They translated them, copied them, adapted them for new audiences, took them along trade routes linking the Near East with Central Asia and China. This is how a Jewish story about rebellious angels and doomed giants gained an afterlife thousands of miles from Judea. Not in one clean jump, probably, not with a single traveller carrying a complete Aramaic manuscript from the Dead Sea to the edge of the Taklamakan Desert. The evidence does not give us that kind of neat cinematic journey. Instead, it suggests a long chain of transmission. Enochic traditions were already circulating in the Jewish world before Mani. Some reached Syriac-speaking and Aramaic-speaking communities in Mesopotamia. Mani seems to have known versions of these traditions, or traditions closely related to them. His followers then treated the story of the giants as meaningful within their own cosmic system. And they preserved it. That preservation is one of the great accidents of ancient literature. The Qumran fragments are older. They are closer in language and setting to the original Jewish composition, but they are painfully incomplete. Small pieces of parchment, broken lines, names without full scenes, scenes without their beginning or end. The Manichaean material is later, and it has been reshaped, but it is often much fuller. It contains recognizable figures from the Aramaic fragments. Mahaway appears there, though his name changes form in different languages. Ohyah and Hahyah appear as well. The giants still have troubling dreams. Enoch still delivers a message of judgment. The Watchers and their offspring still stand beneath a sentence they cannot easily escape. Suddenly, fragments that looked almost hopeless at Qumran can be read beside a longer story preserved in Central Asian languages. It is like finding a handful of burned pages from an ancient play, then discovering that centuries later someone had translated parts of that play into several foreign languages. The translation may not preserve every word. It may contain additions, explanations, even changes in emphasis. But it can still tell you which characters were speaking, what kind of scene was unfolding, and where the plot may have been going. That is the value of the Manichaean versions. They do not give scholars the original Book of Giants back. Nothing can do that. They are not a time machine. They are witnesses, not identical copies. But they preserve material missing from the surviving Aramaic pieces, including longer narrative sequences and details that make the Qumran fragments easier to understand. At the same time, this creates a problem, because every act of preservation is also an act of change. A Manichaean scribe was not simply preserving a Jewish text in a vacuum. He was copying it inside a new religious world, one with its own sacred vocabulary, its own theology, its own ideas about revelation, evil, salvation, and the struggle of light against darkness. So when we read the later versions, we have to ask difficult questions. Which details belong to the older Jewish story? Which details were added by Manichaean interpreters? Which names have changed only because they moved through different languages? And which changes reflect a deeper rewriting of the story itself? This is where the work becomes less like reading a book and more like archaeology. You cannot just take the fullest surviving version and assume it is the earliest. Later texts can preserve old material, but they can also preserve later imagination. A detail found in a Sogdian or Middle Persian fragment may be ancient. It may also be Manichaean. Sometimes scholars can compare it with the Aramaic fragments and see a clear connection. Sometimes they can compare names, plot patterns, and phrases across languages, and sometimes the answer remains uncertain. That uncertainty is not a failure. It is the real condition of ancient texts. The Book of Giants survived because different communities found something worth keeping in it. Jewish writers connected it to Enoch and the flood. The Qumran community copied it among other writings concerned with angels, judgment, and the hidden order of the universe. Manichaeans saw in its fallen heavenly beings and condemned giants a story that could speak to their own vision of a cosmos trapped in conflict. The story changed settings, it crossed languages, it moved from parchment in Judea to manuscripts carried across Asia, and somehow, through all that movement, the anxious voices of the giants remained recognizable. Mahaway still seeks knowledge, the giants still dream. Enoch still speaks from the side of heaven. Judgment still comes. That route from a Jewish Aramaic composition to Manichaean manuscripts found along the Silk Road is one of the most remarkable features of the Book of Giants. A work preserved only in scraps near the Dead Sea turns out to have belonged to a much larger world. But the larger world also leaves us with a difficult gift. The fuller Manichaean story can help us read the shattered Aramaic fragments. It can also tempt us to forget just how shattered they are. That temptation is understandable. Imagine you're trying to reconstruct a lost story from scraps no larger than your hand. Then, hundreds of years later, you find longer versions of what appears to be the same story. They preserve familiar names, familiar dreams, familiar warnings. They even preserve the strange central image of giant children, born from a rebellion in heaven, discovering that their own destruction has already been written. Of course you want to fit the pieces together, but this is where patience matters. The Manichaean versions are not simply the Book of Giants as it was first written, preserved untouched in a different place. They are descendants of that older story, maybe close descendants in some passages, more distant ones in others, like a family resemblance carried across centuries, countries, and languages. The surviving Manichaean material comes from a remarkable range of places and languages. There are texts in Middle Persian, the prestige language of the Sasanian-Iranian world. There are Parthian texts connected with an older Iranian language used widely in Manichaean religious literature. There are Sogdian fragments from Central Asia, from communities living along the trade routes that later historians call the Silk Road. And there are versions in Old Uyghur, copied much farther east among Turkic-speaking communities. Some additional traces appear in other languages as well, because Manichaeism was unusually good at crossing borders. It became one of the most geographically widespread religions of late antiquity. Its missionaries travelled west toward the Roman world, south toward Egypt and North Africa, east through Iran and Central Asia, and eventually into China. Wherever it went, it translated. And translation is never just moving words from one language into another. It means choosing equivalents, deciding which divine titles make sense, explaining unfamiliar names, replacing a term that has no easy counterpart, sometimes preserving an old phrase because it is sacred, sometimes changing it because the new audience would not understand it otherwise. Think about what that meant for a story like the Book of Giants. Its earliest surviving form was written in Aramaic and belonged to a Jewish world shaped by Genesis, Enoch, the Watchers, and the coming flood. Its characters lived in a universe ruled by the God of Israel, surrounded by angels, heavenly tablets, forbidden knowledge, and an approaching judgment. But when Manichaeans inherited the story, they read it inside a different cosmic map. Manichaean teaching described reality as a vast struggle between two opposed realms. On one side stood the world of light, pure, divine, and eternal. On the other stood the world of darkness, chaotic, hungry, and entangled with matter. Human beings in this system contained particles of light trapped in a material world. Salvation meant awakening, knowledge, discipline, and the eventual release of that imprisoned light. That is not the same theological world as the Qumran Book of Giants. So the old story could not enter Manichaeism without acquiring a new setting. The fallen beings and their violent offspring were useful here. They could be understood as figures within the larger drama of cosmic disorder. Their rebellion, their corruption, their monstrous appetite, their eventual punishment, all of it could be read as evidence that the material world was a place of confusion and captivity, a world in which heavenly order had been violated and disaster followed. But the Manichaeans did not need to erase the old story to make it meaningful. They could reinterpret it. That is one reason the links to the Qumran fragments are so important. Beneath the changes, certain patterns remain stubbornly recognizable. Mahaway is still there. His name appears in altered forms, because names do strange things when they pass from Aramaic into Iranian languages and then through generations of scribes. In the Manichaean texts, he is often called Mahaway, or a closely related form. But he remains the giant who travels, seeks knowledge, and brings back a message connected with Enoch. Ohyah and Hahyah remain too, though their names also shift in spelling and pronunciation. They are still giants troubled by dreams. They still seek interpretation. They still learn that the power they thought they possessed cannot protect them from the sentence coming against them. Enoch remains the great interpreter. This is one of the strongest continuities between the Aramaic fragments and the later material. In both, Enoch is not simply a distant ancestor listed in Genesis. He is a figure with access to hidden knowledge. He receives or reads heavenly messages. He explains dreams. He reveals judgment before it arrives. The very structure of the story survives. The Watchers rebel. Giants appear. The giants become violent and fearful. Dreams disturb them. A messenger goes to Enoch. Enoch's answer brings no comfort. The destruction of the giants is certain. When that sequence appears in texts written centuries later and thousands of miles east of Qumran, it is difficult to dismiss the connection as coincidence. But continuity is not identity. The wording changes. The names change. Even the emotional weight of the story can change. An Aramaic Jewish text might speak in the language of angels, divine judgment, and the flood sent against a corrupt world. A Manichaean version may place greater emphasis on cosmic conflict, demonic forces, spiritual entanglement, or the opposition between light and darkness. A figure who once belonged mainly to an Enochic history of rebellion may now also serve as an example within Mani's much larger explanation of why the world is broken. Sometimes these adjustments are obvious, sometimes they are subtle. A title may be translated using a Manichaean sacred term. A passage may be shortened because a scribe assumes the audience already knows the story. A detail may be expanded because it supports a moral or theological lesson. And occasionally scholars cannot tell whether a feature is genuinely Manichaean or whether it comes from an older version of the Book of Giants that no longer survives. That is the frustrating part, and also the fascinating part. The Manichaean manuscripts are not museum glass preserving a frozen original. They are evidence of a living tradition. People copied these stories because they mattered to them. They read them, taught them, translated them, and placed them within their own understanding of the universe. Every one of those acts helped the story survive. Every one also changed it, at least a little. So the later versions should not be treated as replacements for the Qumran fragments. They cannot tell us exactly what stood in every missing Aramaic line. They cannot restore every lost sentence with certainty. If a Sogdian manuscript gives a dramatic detail absent from Qumran, that detail may be ancient. It may be a later elaboration. The honest answer is often, we do not know. But the Manichaean witnesses can still do something invaluable. They show that the Book of Giants was not an isolated experiment, copied once in a desert community and then forgotten. It had a long afterlife. Its characters remained memorable. Its scenes remained powerful. Its central anxiety remained intact. The giants had strength, size, and violence, but they also had dreams. And in every surviving version, those dreams carry the same terrible message. Something greater than the giants is coming, and that is where the real work begins. Not the work of finding a single complete manuscript, because nobody has found one. The work of comparison. Scholars place the Aramaic fragments from Qumran beside the much later Manichaean texts and ask a difficult question. Which parts of these stories come from the same older tradition, and which parts belong to the long journey the story took afterward? It is a little like reconstructing a song from broken lines, remembered by different people in different countries. One person recalls the opening, another remembers a name in the middle. Someone else knows the final warning, but sings it in another language, with a different rhythm and perhaps an extra verse. The song is not fully recovered just because the pieces resemble one another. But resemblance matters. A great deal can rest on a name. Mahaway is one of the clearest examples. In the Aramaic fragments from Qumran, a giant with a name usually reconstructed, as Mahaway appears in connection with journeys, dreams, and messages. In the later Manichaean texts, a closely related figure appears as Mahaway. He is still restless, still searching, still connected to Enoch and the revelation of judgment. That does not prove that every sentence in the later version stood in the earlier Aramaic book, but it strongly suggests that both preserve part of the same narrative skeleton. The same is true of Ohyah and Hahyah. These are unusual names. They are not generic giants invented by every storyteller. When they appear in both the Qumran material and later versions, connected with troubling dreams and requests for interpretation, scholars have good reason to think they are looking at an ancient shared tradition. Then there are the scenes themselves. A dream of destruction. A giant disturbed by what he has seen. A journey to seek Enoch. A written message or heavenly decree. A warning that the violent offspring of the Watchers cannot escape the coming flood. One fragment alone may preserve only a few words. A later text may preserve a fuller episode. When the names, actions, and phrases line up, the later material can help scholars see where a tiny Aramaic scrap may fit into a larger story. But fitting is not the same thing as proving. This distinction matters because the Book of Giants has no official table of contents. No surviving ancient copy says, Chapter 1, The Watchers Rebel. Chapter 2, The Giant's Dream. Chapter 3, Mahaway travels to Enoch. Instead, there are fragments. Some preserve only a few letters. Some contain a recognizable name, but no clear sentence around it. Others preserve enough words to suggest a scene, yet not enough to tell exactly what happened before or after. Imagine finding pieces of a shattered painted bowl. One shard shows the eye of a bird, another shows a blue wing, a third has part of a tree. You can be fairly confident they belong to the same image. But did the bird sit in the tree, fly above it, carry something in its claws? The missing parts still control what you can honestly say. The Book of Giants is like that. Scholars have proposed different sequences for the surviving material. Did the giants first hear reports of judgment, then dream, then send Mahaway to Enoch? Or did Mahaway's journey come earlier? Was the message from Enoch delivered before the dreams, making the dreams a confirmation of a sentence already known? Or did the dreams begin the entire crisis? There is no universal agreement. And the disagreement is not a failure of scholarship. It is the normal result of working with damaged evidence. Some reconstructions arrange the fragments into a relatively smooth narrative. The Watchers and their giant children have corrupted the earth. Ohyah and Hahyah receive frightening dreams. They need someone capable of crossing dangerous distances, perhaps even reaching the edge of the inhabited world. Mahaway goes in search of Enoch. Enoch reads the heavenly tablets, interprets the dreams, and sends back the sentence. The giants will perish. Their fathers will see their children destroyed. The flood will erase the world they helped ruin. It is a powerful sequence. It makes emotional sense. It also matches much of the later Manichaean material. But another scholar may place a fragment differently, or argue that a passage assumed to describe one dream actually belongs to another scene. A word that looks clear in a photograph may turn out to be damaged ink. A name may have a different ending than expected. A gap between two fragments may hide 10 lines or 100. Even the scope of the original work is debated. Was the Book of Giants a short composition, perhaps a compact tale built around the dreams and Enoch's message? Or was it a much larger work with many scenes now lost? Did it once include a more detailed account of the Watchers' descent, like the Book of Watchers? Did it describe the flood itself? Did it continue beyond the death of the giants and the imprisonment of their fathers? The surviving evidence does not settle every question. What it does show is that the Book of Giants was more than a scattered collection of names. It had recurring characters. It had a recognizable crisis. It had a movement from violence to fear, from fear to inquiry, and from inquiry to an answer nobody wanted to hear. That is enough to reconstruct a narrative with some confidence. Not a final narrative, not a perfect one, a persuasive one. There is an important difference. A responsible reconstruction does not pretend to restore what has vanished. It marks the places where the evidence is strong, and the places where it becomes thin. It says this name is probably Mahaway. This scene likely concerns a dream. This later version may preserve an older detail. This gap cannot be filled with certainty. That kind of caution can seem unsatisfying at first. We want the missing book. We want every line returned to its proper place. We want to know exactly what the Qumran readers held in their hands 2,000 years ago. But uncertainty is part of the historical reality of this text. The Book of Giants reached us shattered because ancient books were fragile. They were copied by hand, carried across deserts, stored in caves. Torn, worn, discarded, reused, translated, and transformed by communities who found new meanings in old stories. Its broken condition is not an obstacle outside the story. In a strange way, it is part of the story. We meet the giants through missing words. We meet Enoch through damaged columns of Aramaic. We meet the old world before the flood through scraps rescued from a cave and echoes preserved in languages that the original authors never knew. And perhaps that is fitting. The Book of Giants is a story about beings who believed they were too powerful to fall, yet their story survives only in fragments, dependent on patient readers to bring its scattered pieces close enough together that its warning can still be heard. But there is another question hiding behind all those broken pieces. When was this book actually written, and who wrote it? At first, that may sound like the kind of question with a simple answer. The fragments were found near Qumran. Qumran flourished during the last centuries before the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 CE. So perhaps the Book of Giants was written there, by the people who lived beside the Dead Sea. That is possible. It is not proven, and the difference matters. The surviving copies from Qumran give us an important date. They tell us that the Book of Giants existed by the time those particular manuscripts were copied. A manuscript cannot be copied before the text it contains has been composed. But a copy is not an original. If you find a printed book from 1950, you know the book existed in 1950. You do not know whether it was written in 1949, 1850, or 50 years before that. The physical object gives you a latest possible date for the composition. It does not automatically give you the moment when the author first created the work. The Book of Giants works the same way. The Qumran manuscripts are generally dated, through handwriting and other physical features, to the late Second Temple period, broadly around the 1st century BCE and perhaps into the 1st century CE. The exact date varies from fragment to fragment, and paleography is not a stopwatch. Ancient scribes did not sign every page with a year and a month. Still, the basic point is secure. Copies of the Book of Giants were being read, copied, and preserved in Judea before the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. The composition itself is probably older. How much older is harder to say. Many scholars place its origins somewhere in the Second Temple period, the long era between the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple after the Babylonian exile and its destruction by Rome. More specifically, proposals often place the book in the Hellenistic age, perhaps in the 3rd or 2nd century BCE. That would make it broadly contemporary with, or perhaps somewhat later than, other early Enochic writings. But perhaps is doing real work there. The Book of Giants contains figures already familiar from the Enochic world. The Watchers have descended. Their forbidden knowledge has damaged the earth. Their enormous children have become violent. Enoch is the one human being capable of receiving and explaining heavenly messages. Judgment is approaching, and the flood is no longer just a disaster. It is a sentence. This means the book almost certainly belongs to the same large imaginative universe as the Book of Watchers. But belonging to the same universe does not mean it had the same author. Ancient Jewish writings were not usually produced the way modern books are. There may not have been one person sitting in a room inventing every scene from nothing, then publishing a finished text under a clear personal name. Stories travelled orally, scribes copied them, teachers expanded them, communities preserved some versions and ignored others. A new work could take an older tradition, shift its focus, add new names, and create something distinct. That may be what happened here. The Book of Giants seems to know the Watcher's tradition, but it looks at that tradition from a different angle. The Book of Watchers is deeply concerned with the rebel angels, their descent, their teachings, their guilt, and their punishment. The Book of Giants turns its attention toward the next generation. It asks what the giants knew, what they feared, what they dreamed when the end came close enough to see. That shift suggests a writer or a circle of writers working creatively within Enochic tradition, rather than simply copying an existing story. Some scholars therefore speak of Enochic circles. This does not mean we can point to a building, identify a club, or name the members. It is a careful way of describing people who shared a body of traditions centered on Enoch, heavenly journeys, angelic rebellion, cosmic secrets, judgment, calendars, dreams, and the belief that ancient wisdom had been revealed long before Moses. They may have been scribes, they may have been teachers. They may have belonged to several communities spread across Judea and beyond. They may not all have agreed with one another. What they shared was an interest in a particular vision of the world. History was not merely the story of kings, armies, and temples. It was also the story of heavenly rebellion, hidden knowledge, corrupted humanity, and a coming judgment that reached from earth into heaven. The Book of Giants fits that vision remarkably well. But then we come back to Qumran. The caves near Qumran preserved multiple copies of Enochic texts. They also preserve texts with ideas that sound strongly connected to the community, often associated with the site. Strict rules, communal meals, ritual purity, sharp language about the righteous and the wicked, and expectations of an approaching final conflict. For a long time it was tempting to imagine a neat answer. The people at Qumran wrote the Enochic books. They copied them. They stored them in caves. End of mystery. But history is rarely that neat. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not one single library written by one single group. They include biblical manuscripts, legal writings, prayers, commentaries, calendars, wisdom texts, and works that may have circulated widely among different Jewish communities. Some were likely composed by the Qumran-associated sectarian community. Others may have been collected from outside it. Some may have been valued precisely because they were older than the community itself. Finding a text at Qumran tells us that someone there, or someone connected with the caves, possessed it. It does not prove that they wrote it. Think of a modern library. Finding a copy of Plato does not mean the librarians were ancient Greek philosophers. Finding a book in a monastery does not mean the monks composed it. Preservation shows interest. It can show authority, usefulness, or devotion. But it does not automatically reveal authorship. So did the Qumran community create the Book of Giants? We do not know. They may have copied it because it spoke to their concerns. A world corrupted by violence, knowledge used wrongly, a small righteous group living among the wicked, divine judgment delayed, but certain. Those themes would have carried enormous force for a community that saw itself as separated from a corrupt society. Or the book may have entered their collection already old, already respected, already part of a wider Enochic tradition, moving through the Jewish world. Maybe both are true in different ways. Perhaps the story began in one setting, was revised or copied in another, and found especially devoted readers at Qumran. Ancient texts often had long lives before they reached the form preserved in a particular manuscript. That is why the honest answer to dating and authorship remains cautious. The Book of Giants is ancient. It belongs to the rich and restless world of Second Temple Judaism. It was copied at Qumran before the end of that world. It was closely related to other Enochic writings, and it may have emerged from circles deeply invested in Enoch's authority and the mysteries of the heavenly realm. Beyond that, the ground becomes less solid. We do not know the author's name. We do not know the precise year of composition. We do not know whether the people at Qumran first created the story, revised it, or simply treasured it. What we have is something more fragile, but also more interesting. A book with no surviving author, preserved by a community whose relationship to it cannot be reduced to one sentence, carrying traditions that may already have been old when the scribe set ink to parchment. And that uncertainty changes how we read it. The Book of Giants is not just a strange lost tale from a desert cave. It is evidence of a living conversation, a conversation about evil, power, revelation, and judgment. A conversation carried across generations by people who believed the older stories still had something urgent to say. And that brings us to the question that matters most. What does the Book of Giants actually add? After all, the basic story was already there. Genesis had given readers a few haunting lines about the sons of God, the daughters of men, the Nephilim, and a world descending into violence before the flood. The Book of Watchers had expanded that passage into a vast rebellion. Angels came down. They took human wives. They taught forbidden arts. Their giant children devastated the earth. Heaven responded with judgment. So why tell another version? Because the Book of Giants does not simply repeat the story of fallen angels. It changes where we stand inside it. The Book of Watchers looks upward toward the rebels who crossed the boundary between heaven and earth. It asks how angelic knowledge became corruption. It follows the Watchers into guilt, imprisonment, and divine punishment. The Book of Giants looks downward, or perhaps inward. It places us among the children of that rebellion. These giants are still violent. They belong to a world already marked for destruction. The surviving fragments do not turn them into innocent victims, and they do not erase the harm they have caused. But they give them something unexpected. Fear, the giant's dream. They wake disturbed by images they cannot understand. A garden is destroyed, trees are cut down, waters rise. Creatures vanish, the details are broken and difficult to reconstruct, but the basic atmosphere is clear. Something terrible is coming. The giants sense it before they can explain it, and that is the book's distinctive power. For once the giants are not just monsters in the background of an angelic catastrophe. They are characters facing a future they cannot escape. They argue. They send Mahaway across the world to seek Enoch. Ohyah and Hahyah struggle with dreams that seem to announce their doom. They want an interpretation, they want certainty, they want, perhaps, a way out. But the answer they receive is not comforting. Their dreams are warnings. Their strength will not save them. Their immense bodies, legendary parentage, and violent power will not protect them when judgment arrives. The flood is no longer a distant theological idea. It is becoming real, personal, and unavoidable. That changes the emotional shape of the Enochic story. The Book of Watchers asks, in part, how evil entered the human world through heavenly rebellion. The Book of Giants asks what it feels like when the descendants of that rebellion realize that history is turning against them. It is a story about power meeting a limit, about beings who may have thought themselves too large to defeat, discovering that the universe has a judge. And there is another important difference. The giants seek knowledge, but knowledge does not rescue them. That is almost the opposite of the forbidden teachings brought by the Watchers. Those teachings gave human beings weapons, enchantments, cosmetics, metalworking, and techniques associated with power and desire. Knowledge in that earlier story is dangerous because it has been given wrongly and used destructively. In the Book of Giants, the giants seek a different kind of knowledge. They want to know what their dreams mean. They want Enoch to read the signs. But understanding the warning does not cancel the sentence. They can receive the message. They cannot undo what has already been set in motion. That is a subtle but important expansion of Enochic thought. Judgment is not merely punishment after the fact. It is a reality that casts its shadow ahead of it. The doomed can see the shadow. They can ask about it. They can be terrified by it, and still they may be unable to change the end. Now, people sometimes introduce this text with a dramatic phrase, "The Book of Giants is what the Dead Sea Scrolls left out of Enoch." It is a good mystery. It is not quite accurate history. The Dead Sea Scrolls did not leave out the Book of Giants, as though ancient editors had removed a missing chapter from a complete Book of Enoch. The Book of Giants appears to have been a separate work, though one deeply connected to the same Enochic world. It shared characters, themes, and assumptions with the Book of Watchers, but it had its own scenes, its own interests, and perhaps its own long history of transmission. The phrase still captures something real. For centuries, many readers knew Enoch mainly through the form preserved in Ethiopian tradition. Then the caves near the Dead Sea produced Aramaic fragments of a related story that had survived nowhere else in its original Jewish setting. Suddenly, the ancient world of angels and giants became larger than the book people thought they knew. Not completely different, just larger, stranger, and less finished. That is why fragmentary texts continue to matter. They remind us that ancient traditions were not sealed containers. They were living worlds. Stories moved from community to community, language to language, manuscript to manuscript. Some survived almost whole, some survived only in quotations. Some survived as translations made centuries later by religious movements with very different beliefs. Some survived as a few dark lines on parchment, waiting for scholars to argue over a single name. And those broken lines still shape the modern imagination. When people picture fallen angels, giant offspring, secret heavenly knowledge, prophetic dreams, or a flood as cosmic judgment, they are often drawing from a much wider pool of traditions than Genesis alone. Enoch helped create that pool. The Book of Giants deepened it. Later Jewish, Christian, Manichaean, medieval and modern readers kept returning to it. Perhaps because the story touches an old human fear. What if power does not understand itself? What if the strongest beings in the world are still confused by the signs around them? What if they realize too late that the future has already begun? The Book of Giants cannot answer every question. Too much of it is gone. We do not possess a clean beginning, a complete middle, and a final page that closes the story neatly. We have fragments, names, dreams, warnings, a journey to Enoch, and the sense of a disaster approaching through broken words. But perhaps that is fitting. A book about creatures trying to understand a judgment they cannot fully see has itself reached us only in pieces. What survives tells us something. What is missing tells us something too. And beyond both, there remains the ancient silence, all the lines never copied, all the scrolls never found, all the questions Mahaway may have asked that no surviving fragment can answer. And so we return to the giants, standing inside their dreams. They are enormous, violent, born from a broken boundary between heaven and earth. Yet in the surviving story, their most memorable quality is not their strength. It is their fear. Ohyah and Hahyah see images of destruction. Mahaway travels to Enoch for an answer. The giants want someone to tell them that the dreams mean something else. That the trees will not fall, that the waters will not come. That power, ancestry, and sheer size can still change what is waiting for them. But the warning remains, and that warning has crossed an astonishing distance to reach us. Not as one complete ancient book, carefully preserved from first page to last. Instead, the Book of Giants survives through scattered Aramaic fragments from Qumran, through quotations and echoes, and through later versions preserved in Manichaean languages far from the Judean desert. Each piece carries part of the story. Each piece also carries uncertainty. Scholars can compare names, phrases, dreams, and narrative patterns. They can make careful reconstructions. Sometimes those reconstructions are compelling. Sometimes a few damaged letters leave several possible readings. This is not a weakness in the story. It is part of what makes it historical. We are not hearing a perfect voice from the past. We are listening through breaks in the parchment. Maybe that is why vanished books hold such power over us. They promise forbidden knowledge, then deny us the full answer. They speak of judgment but leave the final shape of their warning partly in shadow. They remind us that whole worlds of imagination can survive in a name, a dream, a sentence copied into another language centuries later. The giants could not escape the meaning of their dreams. We cannot completely escape the mystery of their book, and perhaps, for a quiet moment, that is enough. If you enjoyed this journey into the Book of Giants, please like, comment, and subscribe. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. And if you would like to support the channel in the best possible way, listen on Spotify through the link in the description. For now, rest well.